Hey guys, tonight we step back in time, far enough that deodorant hasn't been invented yet, soap is optional, and even the concept of fresh air feels suspiciously like a myth. You're arriving, in your imagination at least, at a real medieval castle. It's twilight, that soft, honeyed hour when the torches begin to flicker on the walls and the guards at the gate are stifling yawns. The air is cooling, the sky smells faintly of rain, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barks at absolutely nothing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trudging up a dirt path toward the main gate, boots heavy with the day's dust. You can hear the echo of your own footsteps bouncing off the stone walls ahead. The first scent that hits you isn't romantic at all. It's a mixture of wet hay, manure, smoke, and something like boiled cabbage that's been left out too long. There's no single smell of the Middle Ages, of course, but castles? Those towering fortresses of wealth and power had a bouquet all their own. It's not the sharp stench of decay exactly. It's more layered, like someone took a handful of every scent imaginable: sweat, tallow candles, moldy wood, damp clothing, horse dung, and tossed them all into one big medieval perfume bottle. You inhale, cough lightly, and remind yourself, this is history in its most honest form. As you cross the drawbridge, you notice the moat below. It isn't the sparkling water feature you might expect from a storybook illustration. No swans here, just sluggish, greenish water, slick with algae, a few floating scraps of straw, and if you look closely, maybe something less pleasant drifting along the surface. Moats weren't just for defense. They often caught runoff from kitchens, stables, and, you guessed it, the latrines. Historians still argue whether people really dumped waste directly into them, but let's just say, if you fell in, nobody would rush to rescue you. The air thickens as you approach the portcullis. The iron gate creaks overhead, chains clanking as the guards peer down. You can smell the oil used to keep the machinery from rusting, a sharp metallic tang that mixes with the animal musk of the horses tied nearby. Their breath clouds in the evening chill, each exhale carrying a whiff of hay, leather, and old sweat. Step by step, you pass into the outer courtyard. Inside, torches flicker on the walls, their flames fed by animal fat rather than clean burning oil. The smoke hangs low, a hazy curtain that burns the back of your throat. You taste soot on your tongue before you even realize you're breathing it in. Someone once said that every medieval castle smelled faintly of roasted meat, smoke, and humanity. They weren't exaggerating. You glance around. To your left, a stable door creaks open, and the unmistakable whinny of a horse is followed by a pungent blast of ammonia and straw. To your right, a blacksmith's forge glows with molten light. The rhythmic clang of hammer against anvil rings out, sparks bursting into the air, carrying with them the mineral smell of hot metal. If you've ever stood near a fireworks display and caught that scorched metallic scent, imagine that, but all day, every day. The blacksmith wipes sweat from his brow, leaving a sooty streak across his face. His tunic clings damply to his chest. You realize suddenly, hygiene isn't exactly a priority here. It's not neglect, it's practicality. Bathing was difficult and sometimes even considered unhealthy in certain periods. The prevailing belief among many was that warm water opened the pores, letting in sickness. So instead, people layered on clean linen undergarments, which they changed more often than they washed themselves. A kind of wearable filter, if you will. The result? a very particular human musk, one that clung to every corridor, every stairwell, every breath of air inside these massive walls. As you continue your slow walk, a servant rushes by, balancing a wooden bucket that sloshes as he goes. You get a whiff of what's inside and immediately regret it. Let's just say it's not soup. Waste management in castles wasn't elegant. There were designated guardrobes built into the walls, small stone rooms with seats that emptied into vertical shafts. The lucky ones emptied into a moat or pit far below, but often the contents had to be hauled out by hand. And yet, despite it all, the castle feels alive. You can hear laughter echoing from the kitchen hall, smell the roasting of meat mingled with herbs like rosemary and sage, fragrant attempts to disguise whatever the meat used to be before the cook got creative. The scent is comforting in a primitive way, like the memory of a campfire meal after a long, cold day. You pass a group of guards sharing a joke, their armor gleaming faintly in the torchlight. But even that gleam has its own aroma, metal rubbed with animal fat to prevent rust, and underneath, the sour tang of sweat trapped beneath padded gambesons. You catch yourself wondering what the laundry situation must be like. The answer is complicated. Washing large garments in cold water with handmade lye soap wasn't a cheerful task. The process left a faintly caustic smell in fabrics, and because water didn't flow freely within castle walls, clean was a relative concept.
A dog trots past your feet, muddy, half-starved, tail wagging optimistically. Dogs were everywhere in castles, hunting companions, guard animals, and unofficial garbage disposers. They contributed, of course, to the atmosphere. So did the pigeons nesting high in the rafters and the occasional chicken that had wandered in from the yard. The castle was never purely human. It was a living ecosystem of creatures, all adding their notes to the grand medieval symphony of scent. Now, you find yourself moving toward the great hall, the beating heart of castle life. The doors swing open with a groan that feels almost theatrical. Inside, the air hits you like a wall, dense, smoky, and thick with humanity. Tallow candles gutter on iron sconces, filling the space with a greasy sweetness. The rushes scattered on the floor, fresh herbs and straw meant to absorb spills and odors, are long past their prime. Someone has walked through them with muddy boots, and somewhere, faintly, something has died beneath them. It's not enough to make you gag, but you do breathe through your mouth for a while. Historians still argue whether the smell of the medieval world was universally terrible or just different. After all, when everyone smells roughly the same, nobody notices. There's even evidence that some medieval people enjoyed certain strong scents we'd consider unbearable, like the musky odor of unwashed bodies, which was linked to vitality and passion. You can almost hear someone saying, "Oh, that night, he smells of bravery." A platter of roasted meat passes by, carried by a servant whose hands are slick with grease. The smell of spiced wine and singed fat fills the hall. The lord of the castle sits at the far end, his seat elevated on a dais. He's surrounded by candles and tapestries, both of which hold years' worth of trapped smoke. The tapestries, if you get close enough, exhale a faint scent of mildew and dust, softened by the oils of countless fingers brushing against them. You take a seat on a wooden bench that has seen centuries of dinners, spilled ale, and elbows. The wood smells faintly sour, like vinegar and damp wool. The person next to you laughs heartily, and when they turn your way, the scent of garlic, sweat, and cheap ale hits you with medieval honesty. You smile politely and sip whatever's in your cup. It's mead, sweet and sticky, with a sharp bite that tickles your nose. Somewhere nearby, a minstrel begins to play a lute, and you almost forget the smell entirely. Music does that. It distracts the senses, turns discomfort into atmosphere. You close your eyes, let the sound blend with the flicker of firelight and the crackle of roasting wood, and you begin to understand something. This was normal. This was home. Sure, by modern standards, you probably wouldn't survive this castle's first week without demanding a deep clean and several dozen air fresheners, but to the people living here, this was comfortable. It meant warmth, life, and community. The blend of smoke, sweat, and food was the scent of belonging, even of safety. Outside, the night deepens. The guards change shifts, their boots crunching over gravel. Somewhere, a horse stamps its hoof, restless. The torches hiss in the damp air. You can feel the warmth of the great hall behind you as you step back into the courtyard again, and the night smells fresher, though only by contrast. A gust of wind carries the scent of the moat, earthy and wet. Somewhere high above, a raven caws. You look up at the battlements, silhouetted against the stars. The castle looms like a sleeping giant, heavy with history, heavy with smell. You realize that every breath of this place, every smoky inhale, every rank exhale, is a reminder that the past was alive, sensory, and stubbornly human. And as you stand there, under the medieval sky, the air seems to settle into layers. The stones chill, the smoke's warmth, the faint tang of iron and manure, and beneath it all, something hard to define. Maybe it's the scent of time itself, musty, persistent, and oddly familiar. You pull your cloak tighter, half from chill, half from the desire to filter the air a little, and you take one last breath of the castle's truth. It's not glamorous, not perfumed, but it's real. Tomorrow you'll wander deeper, through kitchens, corridors, and the less polite parts of this fortress. But for now, you've entered the gates, crossed the moat, and breathed the first honest lungful of medieval life. And somehow, even through the stench, you feel a strange affection for it. Because it's not just that castles smelled bad, it's that they smelled alive.
You wake, or maybe you never truly slept, in the castle courtyard. The air is cold, damp, and unapologetic. You stretch your neck, and the stiff smell of yesterday's smoke still clings to your hair. Somewhere above, a flag flaps lazily in the dawn breeze, and you realize that the castle itself is breathing too, slowly exhaling centuries of stone dust, ash, and humanity. Stone, smoke, and sweat. That's your morning greeting here, the three pillars of castle life. They mix like old friends in the morning mist, each one asserting its presence in your nose and on your tongue. The sun creeps up over the battlements, though its light barely penetrates the thick air, heavy from the night's fires. The first thing you notice is the castle's skin, the stone itself. It looks strong, but if you press your palm against it, it feels damp and slightly gritty. Centuries of wind and soot have given it a permanent musk, a blend of earth, rain, and smoke baked into the pores of limestone and sandstone. These walls have seen everything: war, weddings, plagues, and they've absorbed it all. There's a faint tang of iron from the rusted gate hinges, the whisper of moss that's crept into cracks, and even the faint, sweet decay of plants that die unseen between stones. You might think of castles as pure stone fortresses, but they were alive with materials that breathed, burned, and rotted. The wood of the floors, the pitch of the roof, the straw-packed walls in servant quarters, all of it contributed to that unmistakable medieval scent signature. A historian once joked that you could blindfold someone, drop them in a 13th century fortress, and they'd know where they were before they saw a thing. The air told the story first. You step toward the inner bailey, where the blacksmith's forge still glows faintly from coals banked overnight. The air here smells of burnt metal and oil, but beneath that is something suppler. The sweat of men who've worked the bellows for hours, leather aprons soaked with their own effort. It's not a foul smell, it's honest, earthy, a scent of survival. In this age, every odor meant something. Smoke meant warmth. Sweat meant labor. Decay meant danger. You learned the language of smells long before you learned to read. You pass under an archway, and a single drop of water splashes your neck. You glance up, expecting rain, but it's just condensation dripping from the cold stone above. Inside the archway, the temperature drops, and so does the smell, from the smoky courtyard to the mineral chill of enclosed stone. It smells like a basement, like wet chalk and metal, and a little like fear, the kind that clings to narrow passages and low ceilings. You can imagine the masons who built this place centuries ago, sweating in the heat, hauling blocks that weighed more than any man should. They worked with lime mortar, a mixture of crushed limestone, sand, and water. When freshly mixed, it gave off a sharp, alkaline scent, almost like wet cement today. But over time, that sharpness mellowed into a dusty dryness that still lingers in the walls. You run a hand along the stone, and it leaves a faint powder on your fingertips. The scent clings faintly, chalky and old. Then there's the ever-present smoke. Castles were smoky on their best days, and on the worst, they were suffocating. Fireplaces roared in every hall, torchlight flickered in every corridor, and ovens burned from dawn to dusk. Wood smoke was the perfume of daily life, but it wasn't the crisp, pine-scented kind you get from a winter bonfire. It was acrid, thick, oily smoke from green wood, damp logs, and animal fat lamps. You walk past a line of servants feeding kindling into the great hall's hearth. The air is already dim with smoke, and the faint haze catches the light like early morning fog. You cough into your sleeve and blink through the sting in your eyes. The smell of burning oak mixes with a hint of tallow, the same greasy fat used in candles, which sputter and hiss on nearby walls. Historians still argue whether medieval people noticed the smoke, you murmur to yourself. And really, how could they not? But when everything around you burns, you stop smelling fire and start smelling life. The heat from the hearth is comforting for now, but it comes with a cost. Soot settles on every surface, creeping into fabric, hair, and lungs. The stone above the fireplace is blackened with years of it. Even the banners that hang near the ceiling have lost their colors under layers of smoke. You imagine the servants shaking them out from time to time, releasing tiny clouds of dust that sparkle in the air before settling again like sleepy ghosts. A boy carrying a bucket of charcoal stumbles past you, and for a second the scent shifts. Charcoal, sharp and earthy, followed by the faint sweetness of resin from pine pitch. That resin was often used to waterproof wood or fill cracks in shields. The smell was strangely pleasant, like a primitive cousin of modern varnish. It was, in its own way, the castle's cologne. Now you follow the boy's path into a side corridor that runs along the inner wall. It's narrow and dim, and the walls are lined with tapestries depicting knights and saints. Only now you see that they serve another purpose. They muffle sound and trap warmth, but they also trap smell. The woven wool and silk soak up smoke, sweat, and cooking odors until they become one massive decorative air filter. When you brush your hand against one, it feels slightly oily to the touch. You lean closer, and the scent is unmistakable. Dust, lanolin, and the faint mildew of old fabric.
If you ever wondered why medieval nobles were so fond of incense, this is why. The air inside a castle was dense with everything that kept people alive: fire, labor, and close company, but freshness was not part of the equation. A servant scurries by carrying a pot of melted wax. She's refilling wall sconces, the wax steaming faintly as she pours it in. The smell of beeswax is actually lovely, a warm, honeyed contrast to the tallow candles nearby. But even this sweetness doesn't last long. Within hours, it'll mingle with the ever-present smoke, turning syrupy and thick. Then you hear the clang of armor from above, someone sharpening a sword on the ramparts.
You follow the sound up a spiral staircase, your fingers brushing against the cold, greasy stone of the central pillar. The staircase smells of iron and sweat. Every step you take has been taken by thousands before you. Soldiers, servants, messengers, all leaving microscopic traces of themselves behind. At the top, the air changes again. A stiff breeze rushes through an arrow slit, carrying in the smell of the outside world. Wet grass, horse dung, distant rain. You step closer to the narrow window, inhale deeply, and feel a rush of gratitude for the simplest thing: movement of air, freshness, freedom. But even here, smoke rises from chimneys below, and the wind delivers it straight to you. It's a medieval paradox. You crave warmth, but warmth means smoke. You want safety, but safety means walls that trap it. You lean on the parapet, watching the courtyard wake up. Servants scatter like ants, hauling firewood, scrubbing pots, airing blankets. The combined scent of human industry rolls upward: wood dust, damp fabric, and that omnipresent undertone of sweat. Sweat, after all, was the quiet third partner in the castle's olfactory trinity. It came from everyone and everything: men training in the yard, women hauling water, cooks bent over open fires. It filled the air in layers. There was no soap powerful enough to erase it, only herbs to mask it. Rosemary, lavender, sage, planted in kitchen gardens and sometimes stuffed into sleeves or belts to keep one's personal aura tolerable. If you close your eyes, you can almost smell the hierarchy itself. The lord smells faintly of imported ambergris or rosewater, the lady of lavender sachets and beeswax polish. The servants smell of ash, wool, and unwashed linen. The stable boy, a mix of horse, mud, and youthful optimism. You take another deep breath and taste the grit of stone dust on your tongue. You can almost feel the centuries pressing against your senses. Every breath is borrowed from the past. And somewhere in all this, you find a strange comfort. The castle isn't pretending to be clean or modern or sterile. It's unapologetically human. Every surface tells a story written in soot and sweat. Every smoky corner whispers about 1,000 fires burned to keep 1,000 hearts alive. The scent of stone, smoke, and sweat might not be what you'd bottle as a fragrance, but it's what built Europe's skyline. It's the smell of survival, the smell of history being lived one gritty day at a time. You turn back toward the stairwell, the echo of your footsteps swallowed by the thick, smoky air. Somewhere below, the day's bread is already baking, the forge is roaring again, and someone's laughter drifts up, a reminder that despite the grime, life here isn't miserable. It's just real. And as you descend into the shadowed corridor once more, the scent seems to deepen, like the castle is exhaling right beside you. It's a mixture of everything you've just walked through: stone, smoke, and sweat, blended into something strangely hypnotic. You smile quietly, acknowledging that yes, this place smells worse than you think, but it also smells of everything it means to be human.
You wake the next morning to a sound that's half splash, half sigh. It takes you a moment to realize what you're hearing, the unmistakable slosh of water and waste somewhere below your chamber. And then it hits you. We've reached the most unavoidable part of castle life, the loo logic of the Middle Ages. The air is thick, even before breakfast. A faint draft curls through the cracks in the stone wall, carrying with it a whiff that can only be described as historically accurate. You'd think a castle, being the pinnacle of wealth and defense, might have mastered the art of the bathroom. But no. In truth, the medieval castle was a temple of contradictions. grand halls and royal feasts above, cesspits and chamber pots below. You shift in bed and notice a small wooden bucket tucked neatly beside the wall. No lid, no glamour, just practicality. Congratulations! You've just met your first medieval chamber pot. Its contents were usually emptied by servants each morning, though emptied could mean several things: poured into the moat, tossed into a pit, or, when someone felt lazy, simply dumped out a convenient window. If you're imagining walking under a castle window on a hot day, you're correct to step carefully. It's said that the phrase "garder l'eau" came from the French "garder l'eau," watch out for the water, a polite warning before someone flung waste from the upper stories. Historians still argue whether this was common practice inside castles or mostly in towns, but either way, you're probably not lingering below any medieval windows tonight. You push yourself up, stretch, and decide to find where all this odor originates. It's part curiosity, part necessity, because honestly, breathing through your mouth isn't a long-term solution. Outside your chamber, the corridor is narrow, cool, and surprisingly humid. That's because castles, for all their grandeur, weren't sealed environments. Waste moisture, yes, from human activity, tended to rise through cracks in the floors and walls. The stones themselves absorbed it. If you put your hand against the wall, it feels clammy. That clamminess, it's centuries of history and other things. You make your way down a passage toward the outer wall, where the garderobes, the medieval toilets, were usually located. The term garderobe sounds polite, even elegant, but don't let it fool you. It literally means wardrobe, because people sometimes hung their clothes there, believing the smell kept away fleas. You pause at that thought. Hanging your clean shirt in a toilet? You probably wouldn't survive medieval logic either. The door creaks open. Inside, it's little more than a small stone cubicle with a wooden seat set over a narrow shaft. The opening below goes deep, very deep, and the air that rises from it has a particular tang, part ammonia, part damp rot, with an undercurrent of sour fermentation. You crouch slightly, peering into the darkness below, and realize there's movement down there. Not ghosts, just nature doing its best to process the evidence of daily life. Some garderobes dropped waste directly into the moat or a cesspit below, others into long shafts that led to catchment basins outside the castle wall. Servants, poor, unlucky souls, were tasked with cleaning them out. They were called gong farmers in later centuries, which sounds almost noble until you learn that gong was another word for filth. They worked mostly at night, probably to spare everyone else from the sight and smell of their trade. Historians still argue whether these sanitation systems were advanced for their time or simply the least terrible option available. Some castles, like the mighty ones in England and France, had surprisingly sophisticated plumbing, stone chutes, lead pipes, even running water from gravity-fed cisterns. But the average fortress? Well, it relied more on faith than on engineering. You step back into the corridor for fresh air, which is a relative term in this context. The smell has already crept beyond the garderobe and mingles with the faint aroma of the kitchen's morning fires. It's like someone tried to disguise a bad smell by setting it on fire. A servant passes, balancing another bucket, this one clearly not filled with water for washing. You watch as he descends a side stair leading toward the courtyard. A few moments later, you hear the faint splash from below and the muttered complaints of another poor worker. You can almost feel the cycle continuing. Waste leaves the upper levels, the lower levels accept it, and the smell circulates everywhere like a castle ghost,
that never quite dies. You decide to follow the scent trail downward. It's not glamorous, but it's an honest history. The lower corridors are darker, cooler, and noisier. Somewhere nearby, water drips in slow rhythm. The floor is slick beneath your boots, moss mixed with something else you'd rather not analyze too closely. Down here the air is different, heavier. The faint sweetness of decomposing organic matter lingers in your throat. A trickle of water runs along a groove carved into the floor, a primitive drain that carries runoff, both rainwater and, occasionally, other fluids, toward the moat. You watch it disappear into a narrow crack, and you realize that out of sight, out of mind was the medieval motto of waste management. Still, there's ingenuity in it. The garderobe's vertical shafts were often designed along the castle's outer walls, making it easier for the smell to vent outside, at least in theory. On windy days, it worked well enough. On still, humid days like this, the air just refused to move, and so the castle marinated in its own history.
You reach a small courtyard where servants are scrubbing wooden planks and hanging damp linens. They work quickly, their faces neutral, as though smell is just another part of their job description. And it was. For them, the odor wasn't disgusting, it was familiar. Like a farmer who stops noticing the smell of manure after years in the field. One of them hums softly, dipping a rag into a bucket of soapy water made from wood ash and animal fat. The soap gives off a sharp alkaline scent, like something between smoke and chalk. It's meant to clean, but it adds another layer to the castle's complex aroma palette. You can almost taste the mixture of sweat, lye, and faint lavender from crushed herbs they toss into the washwater. A dog trots by, tail wagging, nosing through a pile of vegetable scraps. It's living proof that not all waste went to waste. Some of it went to the animals, some into the soil, and some, inevitably, into the moat. You glance toward the water and see that it's more sludge than stream. Flies hover lazily above its surface. If the drawbridge were raised right now, it'd seal the smell inside like a lid on an unfortunate stew. And yet, somehow, people thrived here. They fell in love, raised children, wrote poetry, plotted wars, all while living in what we'd consider unbearable conditions. The human ability to adapt, it seems, is stronger than any stench. You walk along the curtain wall and notice another garderobe protruding slightly from the stone, like a tiny architectural balcony of doom. A wooden chute extends out, supported by beams. You realize that this design allowed waste to drop straight into the moat. Efficient, if not elegant. You can imagine a noble sitting there, staring out over the countryside, perhaps contemplating matters of war, politics, or dinner, while directly contributing to the moat's chemistry. It's strange to think that the same people who built cathedrals with mathematical precision and carved stone angels by hand also sat on these primitive thrones. But that's the charm of the Middle Ages, sublime and ridiculous, side by side. The castle's scent shifts again as the morning sun climbs higher. Heat intensifies everything. The air inside feels thicker, like you could slice it with a knife. Every odor becomes bolder. The garderobe's sour musk, the kitchen's greasy smoke, the stable's pungent breath. Together they create a kind of medieval symphony, each note stronger than the last. And yet, there's humor in it too. You can almost imagine some poor apprentice trying to impress a visiting lady by standing near a tapestry instead of the open door, hoping the draft from the garderobe doesn't betray him. You can imagine a knight removing his helmet after battle, realizing he smells worse than the latrine he's avoiding. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually found these smells offensive. Some sources suggest they associated strong odors with health, believing that bad air carried away impurities from the body. Others point out that perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and herb sachets were popular luxuries, proof that even then people longed for something fresher.
You pause near a window slit, the breeze brushing your face. Outside, the moat ripples faintly in the light, carrying with it all the castle's unspeakable contributions. Somewhere, a raven lands on the parapet, cocking its head at you as if to say, "You get used to it." You smile faintly. Maybe you do. Maybe the longer you stay, the more the smell stops being shocking and starts being background. Because here's the secret. The Middle Ages didn't stink because people were filthy. It stank because everything was alive. Nothing was sealed in plastic, nothing sanitized into oblivion. Waste was part of the cycle, as natural as rain. It may have smelled worse than you think, but it was a world where even the odors told a story of life, survival, and connection to the earth itself. You turn away from the window and climb the stairs back toward the main hall. The air grows warmer, brighter, and less intense as you rise. For a brief moment, you catch the faint sweetness of baking bread, yeast and wood smoke swirling together in a comforting cloud. It's the castle's way of apologizing for what you've just endured. And as you breathe it in, grateful, you realize that even in the stink of medieval life, there's beauty. The kind that doesn't come from perfection, but from persistence. The same way a rose can bloom next to a dung heap and still smell divine.
You step from the damp corridors into a new kind of warmth. One that doesn't comfort, but clings. The castle's kitchen greets you like a living creature, its breath a mix of roasting meat, bubbling broth, and something vaguely metallic. The air trembles with smoke and grease, and for a moment you forget about the cold draft in the great hall behind you. Here, everything smells alive and slightly on fire. You stand near the threshold, blinking through the haze, and watch the organized chaos unfold. Fires roar in enormous hearths, not one, but several, each a little sun consuming entire tree trunks. The stone walls glisten with a varnish of old soot. The ceiling is lost in a blur of smoke, its wooden beams blackened like burnt toast. You realize quickly that no medieval castle, no matter how noble, ever truly smelled clean. Even the kitchen, supposedly the heart of hospitality, carries the pungent perfume of survival, sweat, smoke, and spilled fat. At first you think your nose will get used to it. It doesn't. Someone is chopping onions the size of grapefruits on a scarred wooden block. The smell bites through the haze, briefly overpowering the burning logs and the sharp tang of singed hair from a cook who got too close to the fire. The air ripples with sizzling drips of tallow and meat juices that fall onto coals, creating little explosions of aroma and smoke. You can taste it on your tongue, a strange blend of comfort and grime. Historians still argue whether medieval cooks genuinely noticed these smells anymore, or if they simply lived within them, like fish in murky water. After all, the kitchen was their world, a smoky cavern where every sense blurred between nourishment and nuisance. You walk deeper in. The heat thickens. You pass hanging hooks of salted pork, baskets of onions, garlic, leeks, and something unidentifiable but definitely once alive. A young scullion is plucking feathers from a goose, each one floating upward before landing in a puddle of spilled ale. The smell of wet feathers joins the stew. You try not to breathe too deeply. Then comes the cauldron, massive, bubbling like a swamp in midsummer. You peek inside and it's hard to tell if it's soup or witchcraft. Bones, roots, herbs, and grains float together, forming a stew that could feed 50 or offend them all at once. You lean closer, half curious, half masochistic, and the smell hits. Sour turnips, overcooked barley, meat that's optimistic. Still, this was luxury. Many people outside the castle walls rarely smelled cooked meat at all. Here, even the scraps boiled into broth carried prestige. You notice how smoke moves differently here, more slowly, more deliberately.
It curls around every surface, marking its territory. Your clothes begin to absorb it too. Within minutes, you'll smell like a roasted traveler. A cook laughs nearby, shouting about the Lord's dinner needing less char and more charm. You're not sure which is easier to find. The walls tell their own story. Layers of soot, stains from splattered fat, fingerprints of cooks long gone. It's like a history book of aromas baked into stone. Someone tried to scrub it all away, perhaps with lye soap or sand, but smoke always wins. You glance at a corner where a barrel of vinegar sits half open, its acidic sting briefly cutting through the rich stench like lightning through a storm. The floor, slick with years of drippings, has its own personality. Each step is a negotiation with gravity. You notice rats, small, fast, and brazen, darting beneath tables in search of crumbs. They too belong here. The smell of scorched bread mingles with theirs, and you almost smile at the idea that even rodents preferred castle cuisine. Of course, not every odor was unpleasant. Somewhere between the burnt bits and the fermenting fish sauce, there's the gentle sweetness of honey glazing a pastry. You watch as a maid pulls something golden from a smaller oven, its sugary scent momentarily transforming the entire room. Everyone pauses. Even the rats, probably, before the wave of burnt grease returns to reclaim dominance. You look up toward the ceiling again, wondering how anyone could breathe here for hours. There are vents, or at least what passes for vents, narrow slits cut into the stone that let some smoke escape and even more cold air rush in. They work poorly, but better than nothing. In winter, probably cooks warmed their hands over cauldrons and joked that they were safer breathing stew than air. It's funny. The medieval kitchen was a sensory paradox. It was where the castle's best smells and worst smells were born in the same breath. A roasted pheasant might send an irresistible aroma through the hallways, while a forgotten pot of cabbage rotted quietly in the corner. The cooks learned balance, a pinch of salt, a prayer for patience, and a tolerance for stink. There's a superstition among them you overhear. They believe the smell of roasting meat attracts good fortune, but only if it's shared. To hoard a meal, they say, invites sour luck and sour broth. You can't tell if it's folklore or self-preservation, but it sounds wise either way. One of the older cooks, face glossy with sweat, waves a ladle at you. "Don't stand there like a ghost," he mutters. "The air's worse when you stop moving." You take his advice and shuffle along, pretending you have somewhere important to be. Maybe the farthest possible distance from the fish-gutting table.
Fish days, you learn quickly, are another olfactory trial. On Fridays, when meat is banned for religious reasons, the kitchen becomes a festival of cod, herring, and eel. Barrels of salted fish are opened, and the briny, sour odor spreads like a rumor. A few unlucky kitchen boys scrape off scales, their hands slick with oil. The smell of fish stays in the air long after the meal is served, and longer still on their clothes. And yet, through the smoke and the rot, something almost romantic lingers. Maybe it's the communal energy, people shouting, laughing, swearing, tasting. Maybe it's the knowledge that this chaos feeds hundreds. The kitchen isn't just about food. It's about survival, warmth, and the strange intimacy of shared air. You glance toward the hallway where the servants carry trays up to the great hall. For the nobles, these smells become flavor. For the cooks, they become life. You can almost hear a historian's voice echoing softly, "Food unites class, but smell divides it." Someone drops a tray and a crash breaks your thought. The sound of pottery shattering is instantly followed by curses and laughter. You catch a whiff of ale spilled onto the floor, sharp and yeasty, soaking into the rushes. Another layer added to the scent map. You notice a cat perched near the fire, its fur singed at the tips. It purrs lazily, unfazed by the heat, the noise, or the smell. Maybe cats, too, grow noseblind in castles. As you turn to leave, you brush your sleeve and realize the scent has claimed you. Smoke, meat, and a faint whisper of onion cling like a medieval cologne. You'll carry it through the halls, joining centuries of travelers who left the kitchen smelling exactly like this, a blend of ambition and ash. You take one last look. The cooks are still shouting, the fire still roars, the smell is still everywhere. And somehow, amidst the grime, it feels almost human. Because that's what it was in the end, the scent of people trying, in their own smoky way, to make something good out of whatever the world gave them.
You follow the echo of hooves and the rustle of hay toward the courtyard, where the castle's other residents live, the ones with more fur than manners. You think you've escaped the kitchen smoke, but the air out here has its own brand of aroma, the unmistakable perfume of animal life. It's a blend of warm breath, manure, and straw, carried on the damp wind like a stubborn tune that refuses to fade. You stop just outside the stable doors. The smell hits you first, earthy, sweet, sharp all at once. It's not purely foul. It's natural, but strong enough to feel alive. Horses shuffle behind wooden partitions, their tails swishing, their hooves clinking against stone. Each exhale from their flared nostrils releases a mist that smells of hay and muscle. You catch yourself smiling despite it all. It's terrible, but honest. The stable is one of the busiest places in the castle. Horses were the medieval engine, their equivalent of your car, your tractor, your delivery truck, except this vehicle snorts, sweats, and occasionally bites. You hear the rhythmic scrape of a groom's brush against a flank, the soft mutter of stable hands cursing under their breath. A bucket of oats overturns, and instantly the air fills with a flowery, dusty smell. Somewhere, a horse lets out a long sigh, as if it too is tired of the stench. You walk between the stalls. Flies hover lazily over piles of manure waiting to be shoveled out. The straw beneath your feet squelches slightly in the damp. "Don't slip," the stable boy warns, grinning through the grime. He's about 12, missing a few teeth and smells just like the place, leather, sweat, and ammonia. He's proud of it too. "Smells like hard work," he says, tossing a forkful of hay. You nod, pretending to agree, though your nose might protest otherwise. Historians still argue whether medieval castles had designated areas for animals or if creatures simply shared every corner of life with humans. The answer, frustratingly, seems to be both. Horses stayed in stables, yes, but dogs roamed the halls, cats ruled the kitchens, chickens pecked the courtyards, and pigeons, oh the pigeons, claimed the roofs like feathery squatters. You tilt your head upward. The faint cooing above isn't romantic, it's territorial. Pigeons are the castle's quiet occupiers, their droppings whitewashing every ledge. Their smell, part musty feather, part acidic gift, joins the collective scent symphony. You can't help but think the stonework might have lasted longer without them. The stable boy opens a side door, motioning you toward the kennels. "You'll like the dogs better," he lies cheerfully. The smell changes again. Less ammonia, more wet fur and old bones. Dozens of hounds, lean and restless, pace within their pens. Their noses twitch as you enter, judging whether you're friend, foe, or dinner. Hunting dogs were status symbols, prized as much for lineage as loyalty. You imagine the Lord's hounds charging through the woods, nose to the ground, returning to the castle with trophies and ticks. Now they doze on straw beds, their combined odor forming what can only be described as aristocratic funk. A servant sprinkles herbs into their water, mint maybe, a small fragrant rebellion against inevitability. One dog barks, suddenly, sharp and echoing, startling a few chickens nearby. The chickens respond with frantic clucking, kicking up dust and feathers. And just like that, the entire animal chorus starts. Barking, squawking, neighing, meowing, a medieval orchestra with no conductor. You can't help but laugh softly. If silence ever fell on this place, it would probably feel unnatural. You wander to the edge of the courtyard, where a pig pen squats in the shadow of the walls.
The smell announces itself before you even get close. The pigs grunt and wallow happily in the muck, unaware that they're both dinner and sanitation service. They eat everything: scraps, spoiled vegetables, leftovers from the Great Hall. In a strange way, they're the castle's first compost system. The odor, however, is unforgettable. Rich, sour, thick enough to taste. You pinch your nose, but it's useless. The air itself feels seasoned. You think of a saying you once read: "Every castle had a king, but every courtyard had a pig." It seems accurate. And then there's the dovecote. Circular, tall, and echoing with flutters, it's a symbol of wealth. Only the privileged could keep pigeons. Their meat and eggs were delicacies, but their droppings served a less glamorous purpose: fertilizer and tanning material. You peer inside. The smell of guano hits like a slap, sharp and ammonia-heavy. It's the medieval version of industrial cleaner. You can see why farmers loved it and everyone else tried to avoid it. Walking back toward the main yard, you pass the laundry line. A few servants are hanging freshly washed linens, or at least as fresh as anything could be in this environment. The sheets flap in the breeze, briefly masking the barnyard with a hint of lavender and lye. But the illusion doesn't last long. A passing goat chews on one, pulling it down in triumph. The smell of goat breath and wet cloth merges into something uniquely medieval. It's strange to think that all these animal smells were once a mark of prosperity. The more creatures a lord owned, the richer he appeared. The castle that smelled like a barn was, paradoxically, a successful one. Poor villages might smell cleaner only because there was less to feed.
Still, you could imagine the sensory fatigue. The castle wasn't just a home, it was a living ecosystem. Every creature added its note to the great olfactory choir. You close your eyes for a second and try to separate them. The heavy musk of horse, the sweet sour tang of cow, the acrid bite of dung smoke, the feathery dust of hens, and somewhere underneath it all, the faint whiff of humanity, trying to control nature and never quite succeeding. You move toward a smaller building by the outer wall, the Mews, home of the falcons. The air here carries a different scent entirely: dry straw, raw meat, and sharp leather. A falconer nods to you as he cleans a perch, muttering about spoiled rabbit carcasses. The birds themselves are regal, silent, eyes glinting. Their droppings, though, less majestic. "Smells like victory," the falconer jokes without smiling. You suspect he's said it too many times. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brays. A cat scurries past carrying what looks suspiciously like half a rat. And just when you think you've cataloged every possible castle smell, a wind gust brings the unmistakable odor of sheep from the pastures beyond the wall. The entire world, it seems, has a nose. You find yourself leaning on a low stone wall, breathing it all in, against your better judgment. It's a pungent reality check, a reminder that medieval life didn't have the sterile distance you're used to. People lived cheek by jowl with the creatures that fed, clothed, and transported them. It wasn't dirty to them, it was just life. Historians still debate whether the inhabitants noticed the smell or whether it was simply background music to survival. Some records mention nobles complaining about stables near their chambers. Others speak fondly of their favorite horses sleeping almost indoors. Century tolerance, like beauty, was in the nose of the beholder. You chuckle softly as a hen pecks at your boot. Maybe you're starting to get used to it too. As dusk falls, torches flare along the courtyard walls. The smoke mingles with animal breath, creating a kind of rustic incense. You imagine the servants finishing their chores, feeding the last of the animals, shoveling waste into the pits outside the gate. The castle exhales, a mixture of life, work, and waste. You realize now that medieval castles didn't just smell worse than you think, they smelled fuller than you think. Every creature added texture to the air. The scent of hay and dung, fur and fire feathers and feed. It was a whole ecosystem's breath trapped within stone walls. And as you turn back toward the Great Hall, a stable boy walks past you carrying a bucket of manure, humming to himself. He grins when he sees your face twist. "Don't worry," he says, with the cheerful wisdom of someone who knows no other life. "You stop smelling it after a while." Maybe he's right. Or maybe you're just part of the castle now. Another creature in the mix.
You think you've smelled everything the castle can offer. The sweat, the stables, the stews. But then you descend a narrow spiral staircase and realize you were wrong. The air here is different. Colder, stiller, heavier. It carries a faint, sour undertone that clings to your throat. You've reached the underbelly, the place where all those smells from above finally come to rest. The medieval castle, for all its glory and banners, had no modern plumbing. What it had instead was an ingenious, horrifying system of convenience and denial. They called them cesspits, drains, and waste chutes, and they were as essential to daily life as the throne room. Only these thrones didn't come with cushions. You stop halfway down the steps, where a small arched doorway opens into darkness. A single torch sputters in its sconce, giving off both light and the sharp tang of pitch smoke. You peer inside and immediately understand why no one volunteers for latrine duty. The smell is ancient. It's the scent of everything the castle ever wanted to forget. Above you, in the upper chambers, nobles and servants alike use guard robes, narrow stone alcoves with wooden seats and a hole leading straight down into these very pits. Garderobe literally means wardrobe, because people once stored their clothes there, believing the foul vapors would repel moths. You can't help but laugh quietly. It's like using a trash fire as air freshener. Confident, but misguided. You duck your head and enter. The chamber's small, the walls slick with condensation. In one corner sits a shallow stone trough, a primitive drain that once carried wastewater toward a larger pit outside the wall, except carried might be generous. Most of the time, it simply sat there, soaking into the ground, creating a slow alchemy of decay. Historians still argue whether these systems were surprisingly advanced for their time or disasters waiting to happen. Some castles had running water through lead pipes and even rudimentary flushing channels using rainwater. Others simply trusted gravity and luck. Judging by the stench here, you'd bet on the latter. You crouch near an opening, a round shaft disappearing into darkness. You hear faint dripping, the endless punctuation of liquid waste meeting stone. The smell thickens with it. Ammonia, rot, and something unmistakably human. It's the scent of time itself breaking down. Medieval engineers weren't fools, though. They built the pits deep and lined some with clay to prevent seepage into the drinking wells. But maintenance? That was another story. Someone had to clean them, eventually. The unlucky workers were called gong farmers or nightmen. You imagine one now, wading waist-deep in the muck with a shovel, a lantern, and what must have been an unbreakable spirit. It was night work, done in silence and secrecy. They'd scoop out the waste, haul it away in barrels, and dump it beyond the castle walls. Sometimes the wind carried it right back. You can almost hear one of them muttering, "The Lord eats well, but he leaves much behind." The irony isn't lost on you. Above, people dine on roasted swan and spiced wine. Below, the remains of those feasts bubble and stew. A castle's grandeur is quite literally built upon its cesspool. You notice the way the smell changes depending on where you stand. Near the vent shafts, it's acrid and dry. Closer to the ground, it's damp, earthy, almost like compost if compost had given up on life. You exhale slowly, forcing yourself to acclimatize, because that's what medieval noses did every day. Sometimes, guardrobe shafts emptied straight into moats, turning defensive ditches into unspeakable rivers of filth. Enemies laying siege would sometimes discover too late that their water supplies had been poisoned,
Not by strategy, but by sheer hygiene neglect. Imagine trying to attack a fortress while standing ankle-deep in its digestive system. You run your hand along the stone wall and feel a thin layer of oily residue. Centuries of air, moisture, and bacteria have painted it. It's both disgusting and fascinating, a literal fingerprint of the past. Somewhere in that grime might be traces of feasts from long ago, of lives, lived and flushed away. The smell grows stronger as you move toward a slanted tunnel leading outdoors. Fresh air tries to push its way in, but the current reverses halfway, dragging the fetid breath of the pit back towards you. You pull your cloak tighter as if it could protect your dignity. It doesn't. There's something weirdly democratic about this place. Up there, nobles might debate poetry or politics, but down here, everyone smells the same. The waste of kings and peasants mixes freely, indistinguishable. The castle's lowest level is also its most equal.
You hear a faint scratching. Rats, of course. They thrive here, sleek and shiny with a diet of discarded luxury. One scurries past your boot, pausing just long enough to assess whether you're edible. You let it live. It seems to belong more than you do. A historian once wrote that medieval sanitation was a conversation between ingenuity and denial. You can see what he meant. The architecture is clever. Angled drains, vent shafts, trapdoors, but it's all built on the assumption that you never ever think about what happens next. Out of sight, out of nose, if possible. There's a superstition that the smell itself was protective. Foul air, they believed, carried miasma, invisible vapors that caused illness, but paradoxically, they also thought strong odors could repel those same bad airs. A kind of olfactory battle. Some castles burned herbs in the latrines or scattered mint, rosemary, and lavender near the garderobes. It helped, briefly. Then nature reclaimed dominance. You imagine standing guard over a moat that doubles as the castle's sewer. The air would shimmer in summer, thick with rot, and still you'd have to breathe, eat, sleep beside it. You probably wouldn't last a week without losing your appetite or your sense of smell altogether. The funny thing is, the people who lived here didn't think of it as disgusting. It was simply there. They were used to the rhythms, the smells that signaled rain had washed through the drains, or the relief when frost covered everything in merciful silence. Winters, they say, were the only time castles smelled almost clean. You follow a faint draft upward toward a wooden door, emerging into a narrow corridor where a garderobe chute runs alongside the wall. A servant rushes past carrying lime powder, the medieval deodorizer. She sprinkles it down the hole, coughing through the dust. "Keep the flies away," she says. Maybe. Or maybe it just keeps people feeling like they're doing something. Some pits were emptied yearly, others every few decades. You think about that. The sheer endurance of waste, building up like sedimentary rock. Each layer marks a generation of dinners, illnesses, and lives. Archaeologists love these pits now. They're time capsules of diet and disease. But at the moment, they were just something you didn't talk about. You glance through a slit window and see the moat below, dark, sluggish, shimmering faintly under the torchlight. You know what's mixed in there now. You'll never look at a castle's reflection in water the same way again. It's strange. For all its grandeur, the castle breathes through its waste. Every pipe, pit, and drain is a lung exhaling centuries of life. The smell, once unbearable, now feels like part of the structure itself. The scent of history's compost pile. You climb back up the staircase, air slowly freshening, though fresh feels like wishful thinking. Behind you, the pit continues its slow work, unseen and eternal. You think about the gong farmers, their lanterns bobbing like tiny stars in the dark,
their shovels scraping history into barrels. Someone had to deal with the underside of greatness after all. As you reach the upper landing, a gust from a nearby window greets you with the faint scent of roasting meat from the kitchens. For the first time, you don't mind it. After what you've just walked through, smoke and onions smell like paradise. And somewhere deep below, the castle continues to hum, dripping, fermenting, breathing through its oldest secret.
You step out from the damp corridors of the Undercroft and into the Great Hall, where the castle's social life unfolds in all its smoky, fragrant glory. The air here is different, still thick with the mingling aromas of kitchens, stables, and latrines, yet punctuated by something sharper, the scent of humanity itself. Sweat, perfume, burned candle wax, and a faint hint of wine create a complex, living tapestry. You inhale slowly and realize this is the true essence of medieval castle life, a symphony of smell where no note exists in isolation. The Great Hall is vast, with high ceilings supported by massive wooden beams blackened with centuries of smoke. Long tables stretch from one end to the other, carved with intricate patterns that have absorbed more spills than anyone can count. You can almost see the ghosts of past feasts, pressing their elbows into the wood, leaving faint imprints in the scent. Roasted meats, stale bread, spilled ale. The floor beneath you is covered in rushes, carefully replaced each season. They were supposed to absorb odors, but they also became a compost of their own, mingling with straw, mud, and the occasional dropped morsel. You probably wouldn't survive a medieval summer barefoot on these. A torch flickers in the corner, casting shadows that dance across the faces of assembled nobles and servants. You notice that everyone smells differently. The lord's robes carry the sweet herbal perfume of distillation, perhaps lavender or rosemary, while the knight's armor emits a metallic tang mingled with sweat. Servants carry the smoky aroma of the kitchen, and children running between legs leave faint impressions of bread, urine, and faintly fermented milk. It's a multi-layered olfactory experience that overwhelms at first, then strangely settles into a rhythm. Historians still argue whether medieval nobles truly appreciated the odors surrounding them, or if they simply tolerated them as part of life. There are records of perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and even aromatic sticks burned during feasts, an attempt to wrest control from a world that smelled of everything and everyone at once. You make your way closer to a table where a feast is being set. Massive platters of roasted fowl, pies, and fruit are arranged in no discernible order. You notice the skewers of meat releasing faint curls of smoke even before the dishes reach the hall. The aroma is tantalizing, yet mingled with the tang of sweat from the laboring servers and the persistent hint of stale ale from the previous night. It's almost magical in its chaotic complexity, though your nose protests with every inhale. A servant trips nearby, spilling a jug of mead across the rushes. The liquid seeps into the straw, adding a sharp sweetness to the already potent mixture. A dog, one of the castle's many four-legged residents, darts forward, nose twitching, sniffing out a prize. The child closest to the spill squeals in delight, leaving a faint trail of baby sweat and breadcrumbs along the floor. You almost admire the orchestra of senses at work here, even if your senses are overwhelmed. The hall smells alive, but not just of people and food. The air carries the faintly burnt perfume of torches and the subtler lingering odor of old stone, a musty, mineral-rich bass note that anchors the more volatile smells. You brush your hand against a column, feeling centuries of soot and dust embedded in the carvings. Touching it seems to release yet another layer of aroma, almost like a scent fingerprint left by generations. You notice the tapestries lining the walls. They were meant to impress, to tell stories, and to insulate against drafts. But they also trap scent. Years of feasts, spilled wine, human sweat, and occasional droppings from unwelcome birds create a pungent, textured smell that cannot be washed away.
You remember the dovecote from the courtyard and can't help but wonder how much of that scent has migrated indoors over the decades. A minstrel begins to play a lute, and the sound seems to almost mingle with the scents, a multi-sensory layering that defines the hall. Music doesn't mask the smells, it enhances them. The air vibrates with both melody and aroma. You realize that people didn't escape these smells. They lived inside them, breathed them, and even celebrated them. You step closer to the fire pit at the center of the hall. Flames lick the sides of the hearth, sending up small showers of ash and smoke. You catch a whiff of burnt wood mixed with fat dripping from a roasting pig. The smell is rich, slightly acrid, and oddly comforting. Historians still argue whether fires in halls were primarily for warmth, cooking, light, or to mitigate the unavoidable odors. Likely, it was all of the above. Children run across the hall, chasing each other between the tables, kicking up dust and straw. Their laughter mixes with the creak of chairs, the clatter of plates, and the occasional bark from a dog. Every movement sends a small puff of smell into the air, a cocktail of humanity in motion. You inhale and realize that each second adds a layer to the olfactory story. Yesterday's stew, last night's ale, the horses outside, the latrines below. You pause by a lord and his guest, discussing matters of politics and land. The guest is finely dressed, and a faint aroma of perfume and leather accompanies him. Yet under it all is the unmistakable scent of proximity, sweat, skin, and the residual odor of previous meals. The juxtaposition is almost comical, elegance layered atop chaos, refinement overlaying raw survival.
A servant brings in a tray of pastries, the sweet smell cutting through the smoky haze. You take a deep breath, letting it balance the heavier aromas, imagining how the noses of those who lived here might have adapted. Maybe they noticed only what they wanted, tuning out the rest, much like city dwellers today become desensitized to traffic or exhaust. You glance upward at the high windows. They let in light, but little fresh air. Drafts are unreliable, and the hall's ventilation is minimal. Smoke rises, lingering near the ceiling before settling slowly over the assembled company. You can feel the weight of it, a living blanket that absorbs conversation, footsteps, and the multitude of scents beneath it. Historians still debate how much these aromas shaped social interaction. Some suggest nobles and servants used fragrance to assert status, while others argue everyone simply coexisted in a fragrant truce, tolerating what could not be escaped. Either way, the hall smell was inseparable from its life. It was both background and foreground, omnipresent and inescapable. You notice a small group of monks entering quietly. They carry simple robes and an air of calm. Their scent is minimal compared to the rich tapestry of the hall, faint wax from candles, and the clean, dry smell of undyed cloth. Yet even they are touched by the hall, their robes absorbing hints of smoke, sweat, and wine. No one is immune. The hall continues to shift as you move through it. Each table has its own microcosm of aroma, roasted meats here, spilled wine there, the faint whiff of a forgotten morsel underfoot. Dogs, cats, and children leave intermittent signatures, while cooks occasionally wave a hand over a hot dish, sending aromatic curls into the air. The room is alive, breathing through its smells, and you realize this is a kind of living history, a record of meals, labor, and life that no document can fully capture. As the evening progresses, more torches are lit, casting a warm glow and intensifying the smoky perfume. You notice that the air, while thick, has rhythm. The smells ebb and flow as people move, as food is served, and as smoke rises. It's a sensory dance, chaotic, intimate, and relentless.
You take a moment to lean against a wooden pillar, closing your eyes and letting the combined aromas wash over you. For a brief moment, it's almost hypnotic. The scent of fire, bread, sweat, animals, and human activity all coalescing into the unmistakable essence of the castle. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you think about the debate historians still have about perception versus reality. Did people truly find this overwhelming, or had their noses adapted so completely that it simply became air? You're not sure you want to know, but part of you suspects adaptation was necessary. Survival required it. You follow a servant carrying a tray of wine toward the Lord's table. The rich, fermented smell mingles with the acrid smoke, creating a layered perfume that is unmistakably medieval. You realize that the great hall, for all its smells, and there are many, is also a space of pleasure, of feasting, of living fully despite odor, labor, and chaos. As you move to the far end of the hall, the smell subtly shifts again. The proximity to the kitchen, the stables, and the latrines below all combine to create a complex, ever-changing atmosphere. No moment is the same as the one before, and no breath carries a single note. The hall is alive, not just with people, but with history, smell, and movement intertwined. You pause and reflect, letting your senses drink it all in. The Great Hall is more than a room. It is a microcosm of medieval life, raw and honest, fragrant and human. And as you stand there, part of the castle's living memory, you realize that to understand a medieval castle fully, you must do more than look. You must breathe it in, every pungent, wonderful, terrible note.
You wander out of the great hall, drawn by the faint flicker of torches along a narrow corridor leading toward the private chambers. The air here is slightly cooler, though still perfumed with traces of smoke and cooking. Here, the smells are subtler, more intimate, human rather than animal, personal rather than communal. You sense the transition immediately. This is where private life unfolds, where the lord, lady, and their family live away from the chaos of the kitchens and courtyards. The first chamber you pass carries a faint whiff of beeswax polish, mingling with the lingering tang of old fabrics. Curtains, thick and heavy, hang at the windows to keep out the draft, and they absorb scents like sponges. Linen smells faintly of lavender, a perfume added to mask other odors, but it mingles with the iron tang of the metal bed frame and the slight musk of human occupation. You wonder if anyone here ever truly slept without smelling the layers of life around them. Historians still debate how much personal hygiene varied between nobility and servants. Some suggest that while the rich bathed occasionally and perfumed their robes, even they could not escape the inevitable odors that seeped through stone walls and shared air. This corridor smells like compromise, clean intentions trapped in a medium that resists them. A small table holds a wash basin, its water now cold and slightly turbid. The scent of soap, probably lye-based, lingers faintly, but it is quickly overtaken by the more persistent smells, the faint sourness of unwashed fabrics, the residual aroma of meals carried from the hall, and the ever-present trace of animals just beyond the walls. You dip a hand into the basin, shivering at the chill, and notice that even this attempt at cleanliness feels temporary in the castle's microcosm of scents. You follow the corridor further, passing the wardrobe alcove where the lord's clothing is stored. You imagine the smell of leather boots, embroidered tunics, and velvet gowns mingling together. The textiles, often heavily perfumed, serve as both armor against odor and symbols of status. Perfume was as much about social signaling as it was about masking less pleasant smells. A visitor might think the air here smelled of elegance, but if you pay attention, you detect the underlying human reality: sweat, old oils, and dust.
A maid brushes past, carrying a bundle of linens. The air shifts as the fabrics move, releasing trapped smells. The faint ammonia of dried sweat, the sweet tang of starch, and a whisper of lavender added during the last wash. You watch as she places the bundle neatly on a shelf, the act almost ritualistic. Even in this small, seemingly private space, work continues, and with it, the movement of scents. Nearby, a small study is tucked into an alcove. Books and scrolls line the shelves, their pages yellowed and faintly musty. You run a finger along a leather-bound tome, releasing a soft cloud of dust and old ink. The scent is faint, almost scholarly, an olfactory signature of knowledge accumulated over generations. You breathe it in, feeling momentarily removed from the more visceral smells of the castle below. Yet even here the air is not neutral. It carries the faint odors of candle wax, beeswax polish, and perhaps even the lingering trace of ink mixed with sweat from late-night scribes. The private chambers also carry echoes of the kitchen and hall. The corridors are narrow, and the wind carries smells upward from the floors below. You catch faint whiffs of roasted meat, charred wood, and the occasional tang of a chamber pot emptied too close to the corridor. You realize that privacy in a medieval castle was a relative concept. While certain chambers were reserved for the noble family, the castle itself is a living, breathing organism, and odors circulate as freely as air. A chamber pot sits discreetly in the corner of a small bedroom. Its presence is practical, unavoidable, and odor-laden, despite efforts to mask it with herbs or lime. You notice that even the finest chambers are not immune. The air carries subtle undertones of urine and waste, mingling with perfumes and wax polish in an uneasy harmony. You shudder slightly, though the occupants of the castle would have been accustomed to it, perhaps even unconsciously. The lord's bed is large, canopied, and imposing, its frame darkened with age. The mattress is stuffed with straw, feathers, or a combination, absorbing years of body heat, sweat, and oils. You imagine what it must have smelled like on a hot summer night, the mingling of skin, hair, and the faint tang of perfume, a private microclimate of scent, as personal as it is unavoidable. Historians still argue whether medieval people ever slept without some layer of fragrance, or if these smells were simply background, unnoticed after a time. A small fireplace in the chamber releases a gentle curl of smoke, adding a slightly acrid note to the otherwise muted scents. The smell of burning wood mingles with dried herbs tucked into the walls, rosemary, sage, and lavender, creating an olfactory patchwork meant to comfort and protect. You realize that scent in these private spaces served a dual purpose: aesthetic pleasure and psychological reassurance. The air itself becomes part of the domestic ritual, reinforcing the boundaries between noble life and the chaos outside.
You move toward the ladies' dressing room. The scent here is noticeably different. Floral notes, perfumed oils, and the faint sweetness of cosmetics mingle with the underlying smells of heated stone and wax candles. You can almost sense the effort to control odor, to craft an image of refinement in an environment that resists order. Perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and oils infused with herbs suggest a deliberate olfactory curation, a subtle rebellion against the castle's general aroma. Yet even here, the castle asserts itself. A window slightly ajar carries in the distant odor of the stables, mingling with the faint aroma of incense burning in the corner. You note how smells overlap and layer. The perfumed space is never entirely free of the raw, organic sense of life beyond its walls. The private chamber is a temporary bubble in a world where odor is persistent, mobile, and democratic. You notice the textures of fabrics and furniture, velvet, wool, and polished wood, all absorbing and releasing scent. Every surface tells a story: the faint tang of previous occupants, traces of sweat, perfume, and perhaps even spilled wine or food. The scent is a living memory, a a subtle reminder that the castle is not static. It records, retains, and replays the lives of its inhabitants in aromatic loops. A small closet contains the lady's wardrobe. Silk and wool hang neatly, but each garment carries an invisible history, the faint odor of perfume, dust, and body oils. You imagine the ritual of dressing, the careful selection of garments, and the layering of fragrance to assert presence, status, and personality. The scents are intentional, curated, yet inevitably mingle with the castle's natural odors. You move to a small balcony overlooking the courtyard. Fresh air tries to penetrate, carrying the faint scent of grass, animals, and the distant kitchens. It's a welcome reprieve, though the smells of the castle quickly reclaim dominance once you step back inside. You realize that in a medieval castle, even the air outside is a composite of many layers: human, animal, vegetable, and mineral. The interplay between controlled scent, perfume, herbs, clean fabrics, and uncontrolled aroma, sweat, smoke, waste, defines life in these chambers. Nobles might have claimed elegance, but even they cannot escape the castle's olfactory footprint. Every surface, every stone, every fabric contributes to the living smellscape, and you, as a visitor, are both observer and participant, inhaling centuries of layered history. As evening falls, the chamber grows cooler, the scents settling in to a more intimate rhythm. Candle smoke curls lazily in the corners, mingling with faint floral notes and the persistent underlying tang of humanity. You lean against the wall, breathing slowly, realizing that the castle's true character is revealed not in architecture alone, but in the invisible traces of life carried on the air itself. Here in these private spaces, the smell of the castle becomes personal. It is lived, curated, endured, and ultimately inseparable from its inhabitants. You inhale deeply, letting the mixture of wood smoke, perfumes, fabrics, and human presence fill your senses. You are part of the castle now, a fleeting addition to its aromatic memory.
You step away from the private chambers, guided by a corridor that slopes slightly downward toward the castle's service areas. The smell here shifts once again. It's less refined than the noble chambers, less aromatic than the Great Hall, but somehow more immediate, more alive. This is the heartbeat of the castle, the space where labor, movement, and life collide in olfactory bursts that hit you all at once. Smoke from the kitchens, the tang of vinegar from pickling barrels, the earthy damp of stone floors, and faint traces of sweat from countless hands and feet that have worked these halls. Here the servants operate in rhythm, their presence constant yet almost invisible. You notice a line of maids carrying buckets of water, their steps careful to avoid the puddles that have formed along the uneven stone. The water smells faintly metallic from the pipes and cisterns, but as they move, it splashes over straw mats and slickened floors, blending with dust and the subtle scent of cooked grains. You imagine that centuries of labor have left a permanent impression in the stones, the walls, and even the air, a palimpsest of human effort and endurance. Historians still argue whether medieval servants developed an almost instinctive immunity to the odors around them, or if they simply became experts at masking the smells with herbs, perfumes, and scented oils. You lean against a stone pillar and watch as a young kitchen boy, no more than 14, scrubs the floor near the hearth. Sweat glistens on his forehead, his tunic sticking to his back. The smell of burnt wood and meat smoke mingles with his personal musk, creating an aroma that is uniquely his own, yet inseparable from the castle itself. The kitchens are alive, a constant sensory bombardment. Large cauldrons bubble over open flames, releasing a haze of rich, fatty scents. Roasted meats, onions, cabbage, and spilled ale mix in a pungent symphony that could overwhelm an unprepared nose. You inhale slowly, almost afraid to react, knowing that each whiff contains the full story of the castle's daily sustenance. You can imagine the cooks carefully monitoring their fires,
tasting sauces and adding spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, small aromatic rebellions against the natural chaos of odors around them. The stone floors are slick with grease, water, and whatever else is spilled in the past hours. Each step releases a faint, fleeting burst of scent, the floor acting like a living record of meals and labor. You notice a pile of onion skins discarded in a corner. The smell is sweet, pungent, and slightly sour, a reminder that even waste contributes to the castle's complex smellscape. Cats slink in, hunting for scraps, and you realize the castle is not merely inhabited by humans, it is a shared ecosystem where every creature, great or small, participates in the olfactory chorus. A series of barrels line one wall, filled with pickled vegetables, salted fish, and preserved meats. You move closer, inhaling the sharp, vinegary aroma. It stings your nostrils at first, then settles into a strange rhythm with the other smells around you. Pickling was not merely for preservation, it was also a subtle way to manage the scent of storage. Salt, vinegar, and herbs created protective layers against decay, while simultaneously adding their own character to the air. You notice that every barrel has a slightly different smell, a testament to the hands that prepared it and the ingredients they had on hand. A servant carries a basket of fresh bread from the ovens, the smell of yeast and smoke clashing with the sharper odors around her. You follow her as she deposits the loaves on a table, and for a moment, the sweet, comforting aroma cuts through the chaotic medley of scents like sunlight through fog. You think about how these fleeting moments of aromatic relief must have felt to castle inhabitants, how small joys could momentarily mask the omnipresent tang of life, labor, and waste. Historians still argue whether the layout of kitchens and storage rooms was intentionally designed to manage smells, or whether it was simply the result of necessity. Fire, smoke, and airflow interact unpredictably in stone corridors, and you notice how the drafts carry the scents from room to room, blending and layering them as if the castle itself were conducting an orchestra of odors. You approach a pantry where barrels of ale and wine are stored. The smell is rich, fermented, and slightly sweet, but it mingles with the underlying tang of straw mats, spilled grains, and the faint presence of rodents that have made themselves at home. You bend down to peer under a shelf, and a small rat scurries away, leaving behind a faint, musky trail. Even the smallest creatures leave their mark on the olfactory landscape, and you realize that every smell here is layered with both purpose and accident. You step back toward the hearth, where a group of cooks are preparing a stew for the evening meal. They move with practiced efficiency, their movements choreographed against the backdrop of roaring flames and bubbling pots. The aroma of meat, herbs, and smoke fills your nostrils, and you notice how each ingredient contributes to the castle's scent narrative. Garlic, onions, and leeks release sharp, penetrating notes, while spices like nutmeg and pepper add a fleeting warmth. You inhale deeply, savoring the complexity, while understanding that it is inseparable from the less pleasant odors lingering in the corners.
Outside the kitchen, a narrow corridor leads to the armory and workshops. The smell changes immediately. Metal, oil, and sweat dominate. Blacksmiths hammering at anvils create sparks, and the scent of molten iron mingles with charred wood and soot. Leather from belts, straps, and armor pieces contributes a deep, organic aroma that intertwines with the mineral tang of stone and iron. You notice the apprentices wiping sweat from their foreheads, releasing bursts of human musk into the air. The castle's scentscape is as functional as it is immersive. Every task adds a new layer. Every occupation leaves a signature. You move toward the laundry area, where a few servants wash linens and clothes in large wooden tubs. The smell of soap, a mixture of lye, ash, and fat, contrasts sharply with the earthy, organic odors from elsewhere. Wet straw, damp wool, and faint traces of body odor mingle with the clean scent of washing, creating an aromatic tension that highlights the castle's dual nature. Attempts at hygiene fighting against the inevitable presence of human life. You dip a hand in the water, feeling the chill, and marvel at the persistent resilience of scent. You notice small efforts to manage odors, herbs stuffed into niches, limes sprinkled in corners, straw replaced frequently, and fires kept alight to circulate air. Yet despite these efforts, the air remains a vivid mixture of scents, ever-changing and impossible to control fully. Every surface absorbs and releases, every movement redistributes, every breath contributes. The castle's smell is as much a character as any lord or knight. It is omnipresent, unavoidable, and intimately tied to daily existence. Historians still debate whether medieval inhabitants truly perceived these layers of smell as we do, or if their olfactory senses adapted over time to filter and prioritize the information carried in the air. You imagine that life here required not just tolerance, but a kind of sensory intelligence, knowing which smells signaled danger, which indicated sustenance, and which were simply background, to be accepted without thought. You step back into the corridor, taking a moment to appreciate the interplay of scents. From kitchens to armories, laundries to workshops, every activity contributes to the castle's aromatic symphony. Each layer is both deliberate and accidental, curated and chaotic. You realize that to understand medieval life fully, you must appreciate not only the visual grandeur, but the olfactory reality, a living, breathing testament to labor, life, and survival. As dusk approaches, torches are lit throughout the service areas, casting a warm glow that intensifies the sense of smoke and cooking. The air seems to thicken with aroma, settling into a rhythm that is both oppressive and oddly comforting. You breathe slowly, letting the layered smells envelop you, understanding for the first time that the castle's essence is not stone or timber alone, but the living, aromatic history it contains. And as you pause at the end of the corridor, you realize that these service areas, less celebrated, less ornate, are perhaps the most honest reflection of medieval life. Here, in the mingling of smoke, sweat, animals, and labor, the castle speaks most clearly. Its scent is a record, a witness, a story told in aromatic layers that few have the patience or courage to experience fully.
You step out of the service corridors and into the bustling courtyard, a microcosm of the castle's chaos and order all at once. The air is brisker here, tinged with the smell of fresh grass, animals, and the ever-present dust that seems to settle everywhere. Horses stamp impatiently, their flanks steaming in the cool air, and the faint scent of manure mingles with straw and hay. You take a deep breath and realize that no other part of the castle presents such a concentrated blend of life, labor, and odor. The stables dominate the courtyard. The scent here is a pungent, organic mix of horse sweat, feed, and dung, layered with the earthy smell of straw bedding that absorbs it all. You catch the faint hint of oats and bran, sweet against the acrid tang of ammonia. Servants move among the animals, mucking out stalls, feeding and grooming, each motion sending a puff of dust and straw into the air. The horses nicker and shift, their hooves scraping stone, and with every movement, the smell intensifies, enveloping you entirely. Historians still argue whether castle layouts intentionally segregated stables to minimize their odor, or if proximity was simply practical. The stables are close enough for convenience, but far enough that the lord's chambers don't suffer the full brunt, though you notice the faint waft of horse sweat even at the edges of the courtyard. You can almost imagine medieval noses becoming acutely sensitive, learning to filter one scent from another. Dogs patrol the yard lazily, tails wagging, noses twitching at every new smell. Some are hunting dogs, others are companions, but all contribute to the complex scent ecosystem. You crouch to observe a small terrier sniffing the edge of a muck pile, releasing the earthy tang of rot into the courtyard air.
You think about how the inhabitants would have recognized these smells instantly, cues for food, hygiene, and animal health, while outsiders might only gag. Beyond the stables, blacksmiths hammer at anvils near a low-roofed building. Sparks fly, and the smell of molten iron mixes with charcoal smoke. You inhale sharply, noting the metallic tang, the acrid scent of heated coal, and the faintly oily aroma of leather aprons. Apprentices wipe sweat from their brows, releasing bursts of human musk that mingle seamlessly with the industrial odors. The courtyard is a living laboratory of scent, where labor, animals, and craft intersect. A pile of freshly chopped firewood sits nearby. Its piney aroma cuts through the heavier scents. The smell is sharp, clean, almost medicinal in contrast to the stables and blacksmiths. You notice how each element contributes to the overall olfactory texture, a careful, unintentional composition that changes with wind, sunlight, and human activity. Historians still argue whether medieval people actively appreciated these contrasts, or if they were simply part of the background, a constant hum of life. You wander toward the water cisterns, noticing how the scent shifts subtly. The stone troughs carry a faint, mineral-rich aroma, slightly metallic, overlaid with the earthy smell of standing water and algae. Laundry is occasionally rinsed here, adding the faint smell of wet wool and soap. Children sometimes play at the edges, kicking up splashes and leaving tiny footprints in the damp stone, each adding a temporary olfactory mark that disappears with the next wave of activity. From the kitchens, smoke curls upward, carrying the scent of roasting meat and baking bread. You turn toward the oven courtyard, where cooks tend to fires and pots, adding herbs and spices that mingle with the open-air aromas. You catch a whiff of rosemary, thyme, and garlic, bright, sharp, and alive, against the more grounding smells of earth and stone. The courtyard is a living mosaic of scent, each element distinct yet inseparable from the whole. Horses and dogs, children and servants, fires and ovens, straw and water, all compete for olfactory dominance. You inhale slowly, letting the complexity wash over you, realizing that the courtyard functions as the sensory hub of the castle. It is open, yet contained, chaotic, yet structured. The smells are alive, moving with the wind, layering and shifting depending on activity, temperature, and direction of the sun. Historians still argue whether medieval inhabitants designed courtyards with these olfactory interactions in mind. Some suggest practical layout choices. Others hint at subconscious appreciation for scent circulation. Regardless, you can see the logic. Labor, animals, and humans coexisting in a dense, sensory space where every action leaves a trace. You pass a small group of gardeners tending herbs and vegetables. The soil is damp, rich with the scent of turned earth, compost, and water. Herbs release their pungent, aromatic oils when brushed against or disturbed. The combination of rosemary, sage, thyme, and lavender creates a counterpoint to the heavier scents of manure and cooking. You think about how the courtyard functions as a stage for sensory layering, where each smell has a place, a season, a rhythm. Nearby, barrels of ale and wine are stored under a low shelter. The sweet, fermented smell of alcohol mingles with the smoke, manure, and earthiness of the courtyard. You notice a servant wiping spilled ale from the stone with a straw broom, releasing bursts of sugary scent into the air. Flies buzz lazily, attracted to the sweet and sour mixture, adding their subtle musky note to the olfactory landscape.
A group of soldiers runs drills across the open space, their boots pounding against stone and dirt. The smell of sweat and leather fills the air, mixing with the metallic tang of weapons and the faint, lingering odor of last night's smoke from fires. You notice how every layer of activity, domestic, agricultural, military,
contributes to a constantly evolving scentscape. Even movement alone is a contributor, each footstep or gust of wind redistributing aromas like a living, breathing choreography. You pass the edge of the garden, where herbs, vegetables, and flowers release a softer, greener aroma. You catch the faint scent of lavender and chamomile mingling with the heavier smells of the courtyard. It's a fleeting relief, a gentle pause in the otherwise dense tapestry of odors. You realize that even subtle scents were essential in providing balance, creating micro moments of sensory reprieve for those living in such an intense olfactory environment. Historians still argue whether medieval people actively perceived these nuances or if they simply became habituated. Perhaps the courtyard served as a training ground for the senses, a place where noses learn to filter, prioritize, and recognize important cues amidst overwhelming stimulus. Every scent had meaning, warning, nourishment, comfort, or irritation. You notice a servant carrying a bucket of waste from the latrines, moving discreetly along a side passage. The smell is unmistakable, acrid, sour, powerful, yet somehow contained, blending into the more prominent odors of the stables and kitchens. You realize that waste management, though invisible to the casual observer, contributes just as much to the courtyard's olfactory character as any deliberate aroma. You pause by the well, watching water shimmer in the fading light. The air here is fresher, cooler, a temporary reprieve from the more concentrated smells. Yet even this small breath of fresh air carries hints of hay, manure, and smoke from the stables. You inhale deeply, aware that no space in a medieval castle is truly scent-free. Every corner, every stone participates in the living network of odors. The day begins to wane, and torches are lit along walls and corridors. The flickering light casts warm shadows and intensifies certain scents: smoke from fires, aromatic herbs, cooking, and the ever-present undertone of manure and sweat. You breathe slowly, taking in the layered, dynamic nature of the courtyard. It is alive, constantly changing, shaped by activity, temperature, wind, and human movement. You walk slowly, absorbing the smells, the sights, the sounds. Horses paw at the ground, dogs bark, children laugh, servants hurry between tasks, and cooks tend their fires. Each element contributes to the ongoing narrative of life, labor, and survival in the castle. The courtyard is not merely a passage or an open space. It is a sensory nucleus, an aromatic reflection of the castle's living reality. And as the sun dips below the horizon, you realize that the smells you've encountered here, from the pungent to the subtle, from the organic to the deliberately perfumed, tell a story no stone, tapestry, or document could. The courtyard, in all its chaotic beauty, embodies the essence of medieval castle life: layered, complex, alive.
You move from the open courtyard toward the castle's defensive walls, a transition that brings a new set of smells, textures, and sensations. The stone is cold under your fingertips, rough and aged, its surface holding the faint aroma of moss, damp, and centuries of wind-blown dust. Here, the castle asserts its strength and endurance, yet the smell reminds you that even fortifications are alive, absorbing water, smoke, human sweat, and every trace of the battles they have witnessed. You run your hand along the parapet, inhaling the crisp, slightly mineral air, mingled with the faint odors of lichen and aged mortar. The walls themselves are remarkable in how they absorb scent. Rainwater trickles down, mixing with the stone's natural scent, creating a damp, earthy note that lingers long after the storm has passed. Historians still debate whether the stonework was chosen for aesthetic, structural, or olfactory considerations, but you can't help noticing that the sheer expanse of rock carries a scent that feels ancient, grounded and unwavering. Each stone holds its own faint memory, the tang of sweat from soldiers practicing archery, the subtle fragrance of moss, and the lingering smoke from past fires. You reach the battlements, where the air is clearer and colder. The smell of smoke from fires below mingles with the fresh scent of open air, herbs growing in the cracks, and faint traces of stone dust. It's invigorating compared to the thick, layered aromas of the kitchens, hall, and courtyard. You notice small tufts of grass and wildflowers, which add soft, subtle floral notes that contrast with the dominant earthiness. Even here, near the pinnacle of defense, scent is layered, multidimensional, unavoidable. Archers patrol the walls, their leather armor smelling faintly of oil and sweat. Bowstrings hum with tension, releasing a faint musky odor with every draw. You watch them carefully, noting how their presence adds both motion and scent to the battlement's environment. Every human is a contributor, their physical exertion mixing with stone and air to create a dynamic, constantly shifting olfactory landscape. You can imagine that soldiers who spent weeks atop the walls would develop a keen nose for subtle changes, a new smell signaling an intruder, an animal, or even a hidden fire. The scent of tar used to waterproof portions of the battlements mixes with the mineral aroma of the stones. Its sharp, slightly sweet pungency contrasts with the mossy, damp smell of the walls. Historians still argue how much maintenance of these areas affected daily life. You can almost feel the thick, sticky residue on gloved hands, lingering even after work is done, releasing small bursts of scent with every motion. You imagine the black and sticky aroma clinging to tunics and hair, an inevitable souvenir of vigilance. As you walk along the parapet, you notice the faint scent of smoke curling from torches along the walls. The smell is warm and comforting, a human attempt to manage the olfactory environment while simultaneously providing light and signal. Even small details like these contribute to the overall impression of a living, breathing castle. The walls are not sterile. They are alive with odor, movement, and the constant evidence of human activity. You peer over the edge and see the moat below, faintly filled with stagnant water, reeds, and the occasional ripple of movement. The smell here is tangy, earthy, and slightly sour, a sharp contrast to the relative crispness of the battlements. You remember that the water is a necessary defensive feature, but it also carries an unavoidable olfactory signature that drifts upward, subtly altering the scent along the walls. You imagine soldiers spending long watches here, becoming accustomed to the layered aromas, noting how wind direction can change perception dramatically. Nearby, a guard inspects a small sentry post. Leather boots and gloves carry the scent of sweat and conditioning oil, mingling with the faint trace of the stone beneath. You notice that even in such an austere and exposed space, the human contribution to scent dominates. Every person brings with them a personal fragrance, however subtle, that merges with the environmental odors of the castle. Rain-soaked stone, smoke, herbs, and wind-blown dust. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of smell in defensive spaces. Did soldiers rely on scent as an alert system, subconsciously detecting strangers, animals, or environmental changes? Or was it simply a background, unavoidable aspect of their existence? Standing here, you suspect it was both, the olfactory environment serving as both a tool and a test of endurance. You continue along the wall, passing arrow slits and crenellations. The stone is worn smooth from centuries of human contact, each groove releasing faint, layered scents of touch, sweat, and age. You notice the subtle difference between the worn inner edges, touched daily by soldiers' hands, and the rougher outer edges exposed to wind, rain, and moss. Even the air shifts. The inner areas carry a faint warmth and musk, while the exterior smells of stone, water, and the distant courtyard. Small plants grow in the cracks and crevices, adding soft green notes to the otherwise mineral-dominated aroma. You bend down to examine them,
inhaling the faint scent of thyme and small wildflowers, a subtle reminder of nature's persistence even in the most fortified spaces. These tiny additions contrast sharply with the pungent, human-dominated smells below, reminding you that scent is a complex negotiation between the natural and the built environment.
The wind carries sounds and odors from beyond the castle walls. The faint smoke of distant hearths, the earthy aroma of tilled fields, and the subtle sweetness of blossoms in the countryside. You notice how smells drift unpredictably, layering over each other and altering the sensory experience depending on wind and temperature. The battlements are not isolated, they are connected to the surrounding landscape through scent, adding another layer to the castle's olfactory story. You approach the gatehouse, where soldiers' feet scuff the stone floor and the smell of sweat and leather is strong. A small fire burns nearby, releasing smoke that mixes with the mineral tang of the stone. You pause, inhaling slowly, noting the subtle complexity: human exertion, stone, fire, and faint vegetal notes from herbs tucked into crevices for both ritual and aroma. Even here, every scent carries meaning, survival, labor, and vigilance intertwined. Below, the drawbridge creaks as it is raised and lowered. The sound carries, but so does the smell of wet wood, metal, and water. You inhale the tang of iron hinges mixed with the faintly sour aroma of moss growing along the edges. The drawbridge is not merely a functional element, it is an active contributor to the castle's scent, an interface between interior and exterior that mediates the olfactory experience of both. Historians still debate whether medieval people considered these subtle differences in scent as part of their defensive strategy. Perhaps not consciously, yet it seems undeniable that the castle's smells, from the stables to the battlements, kitchens to private chambers, form a cohesive network of sensory cues. Each area contributes, each layer interacts, and every human, animal, and natural element participates in the overall olfactory orchestra. You reach the corner of the wall where a small turret allows a view of the surrounding lands. The wind carries a mixture of scents: distant livestock, damp soil, flowering plants, and faint smoke from hearths far beyond the castle. Even at this height, the castle's scent is present, mingling with the broader landscape. You take a deep breath, letting the cold air fill your lungs, noting how the olfactory experience changes with altitude, exposure, and perspective. The turret itself is a sensory microcosm. Stone walls are damp, faintly mossy, and slightly musty. A small wooden ladder smells of oiled timber and human sweat. Tiny insects contribute a faint musky note as they move within crevices. Every inch of this structure, every texture and surface participates in the castle's layered aromatic environment. You realize that the battlements, often celebrated for strategic and visual purposes, are equally defined by the sensory world they contain. As the evening sets in, torches are lit along the walls, their smoke curling upward, carrying both warmth and aroma. The smells of smoke, damp stone, human exertion, and distant courtyard activity mix together, creating a rich, dynamic environment. You lean against the parapet, closing your eyes, and allow the wind to bring all these scents together. The castle's life distilled into a single, complex, unforgettable experience. Even in these defensive spaces, you see the same pattern that defines the entire castle. Every smell is layered, every element interacts, and every human, animal, and natural contribution cannot be ignored. The battlements are a living record not of architecture alone, but of centuries of life, labor, vigilance, and sensory experience. A testament to the fact that a castle is as much by what you breathe as what you see.
You descend from the battlements into the quieter, shadowed passages that connect the outer defenses to the inner sanctum of the castle. The place is rarely seen by visitors, where the castle's hidden life unfolds. The air here is noticeably cooler, damp, and carries a persistent mustiness, a mixture of stone, mildew, and centuries of accumulated activity. Every step echoes against the walls, releasing tiny clouds of dust and faint aromas absorbed over generations. You inhale carefully, recognizing the subtle layers: human presence, smoke from distant fires, and the faint, organic tang of stored goods. These passages serve multiple purposes: escape routes, service access, and storage corridors. You notice that their very design affects the way smells travel. The narrow, winding paths trap odors, concentrating them and layering them upon one another in unexpected ways. The smell of damp stone is dominant, but interwoven with it are occasional bursts of herbs tucked into wall niches, intended both to ward off vermin and to mask more unpleasant scents. Historians still argue whether these herbal interventions were primarily practical, symbolic, or psychological, but here you can feel the effect: a subtle, fragrant relief against the pervasive dampness. As you continue, you notice barrels stacked against one wall, containing salted meats and pickled vegetables. The vinegar and brine release sharp, tangy aromas that compete with the earthy stone smell. You bend close to a barrel and inhale, catching a complex combination: the sour tang of pickling brine, the faint sweetness of preserved fruit, and the faint metallic note from the iron hoops binding the barrel. It's an olfactory signal that the castle is alive, functioning, and feeding its inhabitants, even in spaces that visitors rarely see. A servant passes by, carrying a basket of soiled laundry. The movement stirs the air, releasing the combined odors of human activity: sweat, damp fabric, and faint traces of soap and starch. You observe the small rituals that accompany this work: careful folding, stacking, and the deliberate placement of herbs in linen bundles. Even in the quiet corners of the castle, humans are shaping their olfactory environment, asserting control over smell in ways subtle and persistent. The corridors open into a small storage chamber. Here, grains and legumes are kept, stored in wooden bins and sacks. You kneel to inspect the contents, and the faint, nutty aroma of wheat mingles with the dust and stone. Tiny insects scurry along the surfaces, adding a faint, musky note to the air. You notice that the smell is dry and grounding, in contrast to the damp, pungent aromas of the outer corridors and stables. This is a practical, utilitarian scent, one that speaks of sustenance and careful management rather than display or ritual. Historians still argue how medieval people perceived these storage areas, whether the smell was simply background or whether it provided useful information about the quality and safety of food. You imagine that seasoned servants could detect subtle changes in aroma, indicating spoilage or infestation long before visual cues appeared. Every smell here is a functional cue, an early warning system embedded in the castle's olfactory architecture. You continue down a narrower tunnel, the stone walls slick from dampness. The faint smell of mold grows stronger, blending with the residual scent of animals from the stables below. You catch whiffs of leather, probably from boots and tools left to dry, mingling with a faint trace of candle wax from nearby torches. The tunnel feels alive, a conduit for both air and scent, carrying the invisible traces of activity from one part of the castle to another. A small side alcove contains barrels of wine, their staves releasing a faintly sweet, fermented aroma. You lean close and inhale, noting the contrast with the musty, damp stone. There is a richness here, a hint of luxury juxtaposed against the functional, practical odors of storage and labor. You realize that scent is not merely a byproduct of life in the castle. It is curated, layered, and manipulated to create moments of pleasure even amid necessity. As you move deeper, the corridor opens into a modest chamber used for baking and preserving food. The smell of smoke is heavier here, mingling with the aroma of grains and flour. You notice a pile of kneaded dough resting near the hearth, releasing the comforting, yeasty aroma of bread before baking.
This smell cuts through the heavier, more pungent odors of the corridor, offering a fleeting, ephemeral relief, a reminder that even in the most functional spaces, life produces moments of olfactory pleasure. Nearby, a small alcove contains herbs drying on racks. Lavender, rosemary, and thyme release subtle fragrances into the air, mingling with the more dominant aromas of smoke and food. You watch as dust motes drift through the sunbeams entering from a small window, carrying scents with them. These minor interventions hint at an understanding of scent that goes beyond mere necessity, a recognition of the importance of aroma in human experience. Historians still debate to what extent medieval people intentionally curated smells in utilitarian spaces. Perhaps it was ritual, perhaps practicality, or perhaps a combination of both. You notice that even small details, herbs tucked into corners, dried flowers hung along walls, alter perception subtly. In a world where scent is omnipresent, these interventions are both functional and psychologically significant.
Moving further, you enter a room used to store firewood and charcoal. The air is dense with the pungent, acrid smell of soot and partially burned wood. It is heavier here than anywhere else in the castle you visited, clinging to clothes and hair, stubborn and persistent. You notice that the smell is layered: dry smoke from old fires, the fresh tang of split wood, and a faint mineral aroma from the stone floor beneath. The room itself seems to absorb and release scent like a living organism, reminding you that in a medieval castle, even inanimate objects participate in the olfactory landscape. You continue along the corridor, passing small nooks where tools are kept. Iron and leather dominate, mingling with dust and faint traces of animal fat used for maintenance. You pick up a small hammer, and a faint metallic tang fills your nose, mixed with the scent of sweat from countless hands that have gripped it before. Every tool, every object becomes a participant in the castle's scent memory, contributing to the layered complexity you now understand is inescapable. The corridor slopes downward, opening into the dungeons, a place rarely visited by nobility and even less frequently by guests. The air changes immediately, damp, cold, and heavily mineral. You notice faint traces of mold, human presence, and the underlying tang of stone and water. The smell is heavier here, more oppressive, yet somehow balanced by the occasional aroma of herbs or candles used to mask it. You realize that even in these darker corners, humans have attempted to assert olfactory control, though the architecture and environment resist complete dominance. Historians still argue about the role of scent in dungeon spaces. Was it purely practical, a necessary evil? Or did the strong smells serve psychological purposes for prisoners and guards alike? Standing here, you sense that the olfactory environment is both inescapable and intentional. The smell of damp stone, sweat, and minimal ventilation communicates discomfort, control, and power in ways that words and walls alone cannot. You move past the dungeon into a small, rarely used corridor connecting to an armory. The smell is sharp and metallic, a blend of rust, iron, and oil from weapons stored here. Leather scabbards add a rich, organic note, mingling with faint traces of previous use. You run your hand along a sword, inhaling deeply. The aroma carries history, labor, conflict, preparation, and care. You notice how the smells of preparation and maintenance coexist with the lingering, faintly acrid memory of past use, creating a multi-layered sensory experience that few modern visitors could appreciate. Even in these quieter passages, the castle's smellscape is dynamic. Air currents carry scents from other areas, blending them in unexpected ways. You catch faint hints of bread from kitchens below, smoke from the battlements above, and the earthy aroma of animals from stables nearby. You realize that every corner, every stone, every object
contributes to a living, breathing olfactory ecosystem, one that connects every part of the castle into a single, inseparable experience. As evening falls, the corridors are lit by torches and candles. The smoke curls and drifts, adding warmth and a gentle sharpness to the air. You breathe slowly, letting the dense, layered smells envelop you. Dust, stone, smoke, sweat, leather, herbs, and more, all intertwine, creating a sensory record of life in a medieval castle. You realize that in these quiet, hidden passages, the castle speaks to you most clearly, not through grandeur or display, but through the persistence, layering, and complexity of scent. Even here, far from the kitchens, courtyards, or battlements, the castle's life is tangible. Every smell is a record of labor, of care, of survival, and of humanity. You understand that the castle's architecture is inseparable from its olfactory reality. Stone and mortar, wood and iron, human and animal, all coexisting in a dense, living symphony of scent.
You step further into the quieter, more private areas of the castle, where the lords and ladies would have sought respite from the overwhelming sensory chaos of service corridors, courtyards, and battlements. The smells here are subtler, yet no less telling. Stone walls are smoother, tapestries absorb and soften the aromas, and floors are covered with rushes, layers of straw meant to cushion footsteps and provide some insulation. These rushes, while intended to add comfort, also absorb moisture, sweat, and the faint traces of cooking smells from nearby rooms. Walking across them, you notice the slightly sweet, grassy aroma that mingles with the stone's coolness and the occasional waft of incense. You pass into a private chamber, a space smaller and more contained than the grand hall, but decorated with care. The smell here is distinctly different, lighter yet layered. Beeswax candles add a soft honeyed note, while tapestries release subtle scents of wool, dyed fabric, and even traces of the natural oils used in cleaning them. The room feels lived in. You catch faint traces of perfume or scented oils from past occupants, lingering in the fibers of the furnishings. You probably won't survive a week in these rooms without growing accustomed to the mix of human, textile, and faint aromatic notes. But for now, the olfactory shift is refreshing compared to the heavier scents below. Historians still argue whether these private spaces were truly odor-free sanctuaries or if the layering of scents was a deliberate masking strategy. You notice how subtle interventions, incense burned sparingly, herbs tucked in corners, and perfumed water sprinkled on rushes, create a controlled atmosphere. These details suggest that lords and ladies, like their servants, were acutely aware of how scent shaped perception, comfort, and even status. A small writing desk sits near the window, its surface polished but worn. The faint aroma of ink mixed with beeswax polish and aged wood rises when you brush your hand across it. You imagine a lord or lady composing letters here, the scent of ink mingling with faint traces of perfume, candle smoke, and the natural odors of the human body. Each object, each task, adds an invisible yet persistent note to the castle's olfactory record, a reminder that even private moments are never truly scent-free. You move across the room to a small alcove where a chest sits, likely used for clothing or linens. Opening it releases a faintly sweet, slightly musty odor. Stored wool, linen, and the delicate trace of natural oils used to protect garments. The aroma is subtle but rich in information. It tells a story of human care, preparation, and the desire for cleanliness and comfort in a world dominated by heavier, more pervasive smells. You realize that even storage in private chambers contributes to the nuanced scentscape of the castle. A gentle breeze enters through the window, carrying the faint scent of the gardens outside.
Herbs, flowers, and damp earth blend with the indoor aromas, softening the heavier undertones of the room. You note how architecture shapes scent. Windows, shutters, and even the orientation of rooms allow air, and with it smells, to flow in ways that subtly control perception. Historians still debate how intentional these choices were, but the effect is undeniable. The gentle layering of indoor and outdoor scents creates a calming, balanced environment. Nearby, a small table holds bowls of dried herbs and flowers. Lavender, sage, and rosemary release faint fragrances that counterbalance the stone, textiles, and human odors. You recognize this as an early form of interior scent management, a deliberate, almost ritualistic approach to balancing the natural and human smells that would otherwise dominate the space. Even here, the castle's inhabitants were orchestrating scent, blending practicality with sensory comfort. You walk across a soft rug, the fibers releasing faint traces of dye and wool oil. Every step releases a subtle, ephemeral burst of aroma, a reminder that movement itself contributes to the olfactory environment. You imagine the lords and ladies walking across these floors, unaware that their every motion added another layer to the room's smell, a living, dynamic record of presence, activity, and care. A faint trace of food drifts in from nearby chambers, perhaps bread cooling on a counter, a roasted bird resting before service, or herbs drying after preparation. The smell is tantalizing, a reminder that even private chambers are never fully isolated from the castle's broader life. You inhale deeply, noting how the contrast between heavier communal odors and these lighter domestic smells creates a sensory rhythm, a kind of olfactory music that guides attention, comfort, and awareness. Historians still argue how medieval inhabitants perceived this balance, whether the subtlety of scents in private chambers was consciously curated or if a fortunate byproduct of architecture and activity. You lean against the windowsill, inhaling the mixture of indoor and outdoor aromas, and realize that this layered perception likely shaped daily experience as much as visual or tactile design.
In a corner, you notice a small bed covered with linens and a woolen blanket. The smell is soft, warm, and human. Faint body oils, the natural scent of wool, and the lingering aroma of perfumed water used to freshen the bedding. You realize that sleep itself, in a medieval castle, carried its own olfactory signature, intimate, layered, and inseparable from the surroundings. You probably won't survive without appreciating these subtle cues, but they are essential to understanding how the castle's residents experienced life. Nearby, a wardrobe stands open, releasing the faint scent of herbs, stored clothing, and traces of previous occupants. The layering of scents here is delicate, yet perceptible. Wood, fabric, and herbal notes mingling in a quiet complexity. Even in storage, the castle maintains an ongoing narrative of human presence, care, and ritual. Every object carries a memory. Every aroma contributes to a tapestry of lived experience. You move toward a small adjoining room, likely used for personal grooming or private meetings. The smell shifts again. Faint traces of oil, soap, and subtle perfume mix with stone and textiles. You notice that these spaces were carefully managed, yet the presence of humans ensures that a natural, organic scent persists. Historians still debate whether such personal touches were widespread or reserved for the elite, but the evidence here suggests that scent management was both practical and status-driven. Candles are lit along the walls, releasing warm, honeyed smoke that complements the other aromas in the space. The interplay between fire, wax,
textiles, and human presence creates a multi-layered olfactory environment that is comforting, intimate, and quietly luxurious. You inhale slowly, noting how each scent, even the faintest, carries meaning, signaling care, refinement, or simply the presence of life in the castle. A small chest of books rests against a wall, its leather-bound volumes releasing faint, rich notes of aged paper, ink, and binding glue. You open one, and the subtle aroma of ink mingles with the candle smoke and textile odors around you. Even intellectual pursuits contribute to the castle's scentscape. Knowledge, labor, and the tactile interaction with objects leave a lingering, often unnoticed mark on the environment. Moving carefully through the chambers, you notice the faint scent of perfumed waters used to freshen linens and rushes. The smell is delicate yet persistent, a reminder that medieval inhabitants actively sought to shape their olfactory environment. Herbs, oils, incense, and scented waters serve as a counterpoint to the heavier, unavoidable odors of life below, from kitchens, stables, and latrines, offering moments of relief and comfort in a complex sensory world. Historians still argue how much these interventions affected daily experience. Was it purely aesthetic, or did it play a functional role in health, comfort, and psychological well-being? You realize that the layering of scents, from stone and textiles to herbs and perfume, likely provided both pleasure and practicality, creating spaces that were livable, manageable, and distinctly human. You pause in a small sitting area, letting the scents settle around you. The interplay of wax, textiles, stone, perfume, and human presence creates a rich, layered aroma that is subtle yet unmistakable. You notice how each element, even minor and seemingly insignificant, contributes to a narrative of care, ritual, human labor, and the persistent, unavoidable presence of life. Even in these private chambers, the castle scentscape is dense, dynamic, and unavoidable. Every surface, every object, every human interaction contributes to an ongoing olfactory story. You inhale deeply, recognizing that to understand medieval life fully, you must appreciate not only the grand and the grotesque, but also the subtle, private, and intimate dimensions of smell.
You leave the quiet, refined chambers behind and step toward the upper floors of the castle, a transitional space between the private and the ceremonial. Here the air is cooler, slightly thinner, and carries an evolving mix of scents. Smoke from distant fires, faint whiffs of herbs used in the kitchens below, and the persistent, subtle odor of human habitation. The stone floors are polished yet worn, and each step releases tiny clouds of dust that mix with the other aromas, creating an invisible, shifting tapestry of smell. You notice immediately that these spaces, while not as crowded as the halls or as labor-intensive as the stables, still function as a crossroads for the castle's olfactory narrative. Servants move silently through these corridors, carrying trays, torches, or tools. Each movement stirs the air, releasing faint bursts of odor, sweat from exertion, traces of soap or starch, and the inevitable mingling of scents carried from kitchens and courtyards. You realize that even in these seemingly quiet corridors, life leaves an invisible trail, a constant signature of activity and human presence. Historians still argue whether the layout of these upper corridors was primarily functional or if it also reflected an implicit awareness of scent, guiding airflow, separating heavier odors, and subtly managing the olfactory experience for those moving between spaces. You pause near a spiral staircase that leads to one of the tower rooms.
The stairs creak underfoot, each movement releasing dust and the faint musky aroma of previous travelers. The stone walls are slightly damp, and tiny patches of moss give off an earthy smell that contrasts with the metallic tang of iron handrails and fittings. You inhale deeply, noticing how the confined vertical space concentrates odors, creating a distinctive, layered scent that differs from the more open corridors below. It's a subtle yet complex experience, a reminder that even the castle's architecture actively shapes how humans perceive its scents. At the top of the stairs, you enter a small gallery overlooking the Great Hall. The scents here are more controlled but still richly layered. The walls are lined with tapestries, their wool fibers absorbing and releasing odors slowly. Faint smoke from torches, dust, traces of perfumed water, and the persistent subtle odor of human touch. You notice the contrast between the faintly sweet aroma of the tapestries and the occasional sharp, metallic tang drifting up from the armory below. Historians still debate the purpose of such gallery spaces. Was it purely aesthetic, for display and observation, or if it served practical functions in guiding airflow and diffusing odors from lower levels? Standing here, it is easy to believe both. A small window opens to the outside world, letting in a breeze carrying scents from the surrounding landscape. Damp earth, flowering plants, and livestock from distant fields. The fresh air mingles with the interior odors of stone, textiles, and human presence, creating a subtle, constantly shifting balance. You notice how the placement of windows, the height of ceilings, and the narrowness of passages all contribute to a layered olfactory environment, one that is neither accidental nor purely functional, but a continuous negotiation between indoor and outdoor life. Nearby, a servant lays out supplies for the day, folded linens, trays of food, and small bundles of herbs. Each action releases delicate clouds of odor, the musky scent of fabric, the sweet and earthy aroma of herbs, and faint traces of cooking wafting from below. You catch yourself paying attention to the rhythm of these scents, noting how minor human actions amplify or temper the castle's olfactory character. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly effective in shaping perception. You continue along the corridor, entering a small study room once used for reading or private correspondence. The smell is soft, complex, and surprisingly intimate. Aged paper, leather bindings, beeswax polish, and faint traces of human scent linger in the air. Opening a book releases a sudden burst of ink, dust, and time-worn fibers, mingling with the candle smoke curling from a nearby sconce. Historians still argue whether medieval inhabitants were consciously attuned to these subtle shifts in scent, or whether habituation allowed them to filter, appreciate, and interpret odors without conscious effort. Either way, the effect is undeniable. Each object, each activity, contributes to a dynamic and personal olfactory experience. In an adjoining chamber, you find remnants of personal grooming, small wooden boxes, combs, and perfumed oils. The scent here is noticeably sweeter, softer, and more deliberate than in the public or service areas. You inhale, detecting the faint floral notes of rosewater, lavender, and almond oil. A subtle attempt to counteract the ever-present odors of stone, wood, and human labor. You realize that the castle's higher floors are where the deliberate manipulation of scent reaches its peak, private rituals designed to offer comfort, status, and a sense of control over the olfactory environment. You pass a window alcove where small potted herbs and flowers were likely kept. The faint fragrance of rosemary, thyme, and marjoram mixes with dust, stone, and candle smoke. You notice how these small, almost invisible details contribute to a sense of balance.
The heavier, persistent odors of daily life below are countered by delicate, intentional aromatics above. Historians still debate whether these practices were widespread or reserved for the elite, but their impact on perception is clear. Even minor botanical interventions create a sensory narrative that elevates these spaces from functional to lived in, intimate, and perceptually curated.
Moving further, you enter the tower chambers, where the air is cooler and drafts bring in faint, mineral scents from the stone walls. You notice the subtle layering of odors, the warmth of candle wax, the faint musk of human presence, the dry, earthy aroma of stone, and the occasional whiff of herbs tucked into corners. These spaces, isolated yet connected, demonstrate the castle's complexity as an olfactory system, a network of smells that shift and evolve with human activity, temperature, and airflow. A small fire burns in a hearth, releasing smoke and warmth. You inhale the rich, woody aroma, noticing how it mingles with faint traces of cooking from below and the softer scents of textiles and herbs above. Historians still argue whether these layered olfactory experiences were consciously engineered or simply the result of habitual living patterns, but it's clear that they create a dynamic, immersive environment that shapes human experience at every level. You step onto a narrow balcony overlooking the surrounding lands. The breeze carries the faintly sweet aroma of flowering plants, damp earth, and distant livestock, merging with the subtle, complex odors of the towered chambers. You inhale deeply, noticing how height, exposure, and airflow all alter perception. Even in these elevated, ostensibly isolated spaces, the castle's olfactory web is omnipresent, a reminder that scent, like architecture, connects every part of the structure into a cohesive living organism. Nearby, a small chest contains furs and linens. Opening it releases a faint musky aroma, mingled with the scent of oil and herbs used for preservation. You run your hand across the contents, releasing tiny bursts of aroma that mingle with the broader environment. It is a delicate, dynamic experience, demonstrating that even stored objects participate in the castle's olfactory narrative. You realize that smell, like light and sound, follows the architecture, weaving together disparate spaces into a continuous sensory experience. A faint trace of incense lingers from previous use, softening the otherwise earthy, mineral-dominated environment. Its fragrance is subtle, a gentle layering that interacts with stone, textiles, and human scent. You notice how even minor aromatic interventions, herbs, oils, candles, have cumulative effects, shaping perception over time and creating an environment that is complex, nuanced, and distinctly human. You pause to reflect, taking in the layered interplay of smells, stone and mortar, textiles and wood, herbs and incense, human activity and animal presence. Each element contributes to the castle's living olfactory system, a network that is dynamic, ever-changing, and intimately tied to both architecture and daily life. Historians still argue about the extent to which these layers were consciously manipulated or being natural byproducts, but the result is undeniable. A castle is as much defined by what you breathe as by what you see. As the sun sets, shadows lengthen, and torches flicker, releasing gentle curls of smoke that mingle with the tower's other odors. You breathe slowly, aware of the rich, layered tapestry of smells surrounding you. Each breath carries history, labor, care, and life itself. You notice how the castle, even at its highest, most private points, remains alive, not just in sight or sound, but in scent, memory, and experience.
Even here, amid relative quiet and solitude, the castle's olfactory narrative is inescapable, dynamic, and profound. Every step, every object, every human presence adds a layer. The upper floors are a testament to deliberate control, subtle ritual, and the enduring persistence of scent as a medium of experience. You inhale one last time before moving on, savoring the complexity, subtlety, and life that permeates every corner of this ancient, living structure.
You descend from the tower, leaving behind the subtle fragrances of private chambers, incense, and herbs, and move toward the spaces that lie beneath the castle, the cellars, wine stores, and subterranean passageways where life is quiet, dark, and heavy with scent. The air here is noticeably cooler, thicker, and carries an unmistakable weight of centuries. Damp stone, musty air, and faint traces of fermenting goods. You inhale deeply, letting the musky, earthy aroma fill your lungs, and notice how every step stirs dust and tiny fragments of old straw, releasing brief, ephemeral puffs of scent that mingle with the dominant smells. The first cellar is dedicated to food storage. Wooden barrels line the walls, filled with salted meat, pickled vegetables, and grains. The aroma is sharp, briny, and tangy, with the occasional subtle note of aging wood. You crouch beside a barrel, inhaling the layered smells, vinegar, smoke from the hearth above, and the faint metallic tang of the iron hoops. The smell of preservation is overwhelming yet fascinating, a testament to medieval ingenuity in food storage. Historians still argue how effective these methods were in preventing spoilage and disease, but the odors themselves leave no doubt that life, labor, and survival were intertwined in every barrel. A narrow corridor leads deeper into the castle's underbelly, where shadows dominate and light is scarce. The stone walls are damp, slick with condensation, that releases an earthy aroma mingled with the faint musky odor of rodents. Tiny scratches and scurries hint at the presence of vermin, their faint scent adding an unavoidable, organic note to the cellar's olfactory profile. You realize that the medieval castle was never fully sanitized. Life and decay existed side by side, creating an ecosystem of smells as natural as it was persistent. You pause near a stack of wine barrels. The scent here is markedly different from the salted meat, sweet, fermented, and slightly yeasty. Faint traces of mold cling to the wooden staves, adding depth to the aroma. You inhale deeply, noting the subtle warmth and complexity, the faint trace of grape skins, the tang of alcohol, and the earthy base of aged wood. These barrels, carefully tended by cellar masters, represent both luxury and necessity, a sensory reminder of status, indulgence, and the practical demands of storage. Historians still debate how frequently wine was consumed, and whether its aroma played a psychological role in reinforcing hierarchy and comfort in medieval life. Further along, you encounter small alcoves used for storing tools and implements. The smell here is harsher: iron, oil, and the faint musk of human sweat from those who handled them. The aroma is utilitarian, less curated than the upper floors, yet it carries its own rhythm and narrative. Each tool tells a story: labor, care, maintenance, and repetition. Even in these darker, quieter spaces, scent is a record of activity and presence. You step into a larger vaulted cellar where grains and dried goods are stored. The smell is dry and nutty, a welcome relief from the damp, pungent aroma of meats and wine. Dust rises in tiny clouds as you move, mingling with the natural scents of wheat, barley, and rye. The faint tang of straw used as bedding or cushioning adds an extra layer,
while the stone walls maintain a persistent earthy base note. Here, the olfactory experience is subtle, functional, and surprisingly complex, a testament to the castle's capacity to manage both life and labor underground. Historians still argue whether medieval inhabitants relied on their noses to detect spoilage or infestation. You notice that the layered, dynamic scents provide constant feedback, subtle hints of moisture, faint fungal growth, or the sharp tang of rusted metal. Even without modern tools, the human olfactory system was an essential instrument for survival. You imagine that seasoned cellar workers could detect problems long before they became visible, relying on the rich, layered environment as a guide. A smaller passage branches off, leading to a space that seems almost forgotten. Here, the smell is dense, dominated by damp stone and the faint mustiness of years without disturbance. Cobwebs hang in the corners, releasing a subtle organic note as you brush past them. Tiny insects add musky, fleeting aromas, reminding you that even the quietest corners of a castle are alive, contributing to a layered, persistent scentscape. Nearby, a hidden niche contains herbs stored for medicinal purposes. Lavender, rosemary, and sage release faintly sweet aromas that stand out against the heavier, damper smells of the cellar. These small interventions suggest that even in the lower, utilitarian spaces, medieval people sought control over their environment, blending practicality with subtle sensory manipulation. Historians still argue about the extent to which medicinal or aromatic herbs were used for pleasure versus necessity, but their presence undeniably shaped perception and comfort in these dark, enclosed areas. You continue into the castle's armory, located partially underground for security and structural reasons. The smell here is metallic, oily, and faintly acrid. Rust mingles with the scent of oil used for preservation, and traces of sweat cling to leather armor. You touch a breastplate, releasing a faint musky aroma from its history of handling and use. The olfactory signature of the armory is aggressive yet functional, reinforcing its purpose as a place of preparation, defense, and vigilance. Even here, in the cool, shadowed depths, scent is inseparable from architecture and function.
Passing through, you notice the faint aroma of tallow candles and smoke used to light and ventilate these underground spaces. The warmth of fire mingles with damp stone, iron, and leather, creating a rich, persistent mixture that seems to define the space. You inhale deeply, recognizing how every layer, human, material, and natural, contributes to the castle's living olfactory system. The air is dense, complex, and intimate, carrying both history and the weight of daily life. Historians still debate how much subterranean spaces influenced overall perception of the castle. Did they function solely for storage and security, or did their scent and ambiance affect behavior, hierarchy, and even mood? You realize that every passage, vault, and chamber below ground is an active participant in the castle's olfactory narrative, shaping experience as much as architecture, decoration, or ritual. You move toward the water cisterns, where faint moisture from seepage adds a mineral tang to the already dense atmosphere. The smell is cold, earthy, and slightly sour, contrasting sharply with the warmer aromas of fire, oil, and human activity elsewhere. Small insects and algae contribute fleeting, musky notes, while the stone itself seems to exhale centuries of dampness. Even in these functional spaces, the castle demonstrates an undeniable complexity. Every stone, every drop of water, and every tiny organism contributes to an integrated, living scentscape. Nearby, a narrow tunnel leads to the latrines, unavoidable in any honest exploration of the castle's olfactory reality. The smell is pungent,
earthy and unmistakably human. You notice the layered nature of odor here. Waste, straw, moisture, and faint traces of lime used to mitigate stench. Historians still debate whether medieval people considered these spaces primarily practical or psychologically influential. But the reality is clear. Latrines were unavoidable contributors to the castle's scent, a constant reminder of bodily presence and survival. Even in the dim, shadowed passages, the layering of smells is dynamic. Air currents from the upper floors carry faint whiffs of cooking, incense, and human activity, mingling with the denser, persistent subterranean odors. You realize that scent flows through the castle as surely as water or wind, connecting every level and every room in a continuous, immersive olfactory network. You pause to take stock of what you've experienced. The heavy, pungent aromas of kitchens and stables, the layered, controlled scents of private chambers, the dynamic, functional smells of storage, armory, and cellar spaces, and the unavoidable presence of human life everywhere. Each scent tells a story of labor, survival, comfort, indulgence, and adaptation. You realize that no castle, however grand or fortified, was ever free of smell. Historians still debate how medieval people conceptualized and coped with these pervasive odors. Did they adapt passively, actively manage scents, or both? Walking through these subterranean spaces, you sense that the answer is layered, much like the castle itself. Practical, sensory, and profoundly human. Every step, every inhalation connects you to the past, revealing the lived, scented reality of life in a medieval fortress. The final corners of the undercastle open onto storage rooms for rare provisions, wine, and herbs. The smells here are more refined, sweet, earthy, and subtly fragrant. You notice how even in the lower reaches of the castle, sensory experience was curated when possible. The faint scent of preserved goods, dried herbs, and oiled wooden surfaces contrasts with the heavier, unavoidable odors of work, waste, and damp stone. You inhale slowly, savoring the layered complexity, and realizing that the olfactory experience of a medieval castle is inseparable from its human, architectural, and natural components. You take one last slow walk through the labyrinthine cellars, noting how the air carries everything from musty stone and fermenting goods to the faint trace of human sweat, herbs, and smoke. Every element contributes to the living tapestry of smell, a dynamic, immersive narrative that defines the castle's existence. Even centuries later, the castle speaks through its odors, layers of life, labor, survival, and subtle care intertwined in every corner, every stone, and every object.
You settle into the quiet, letting the full scope of the castle's aromas wash over you one last time. The scents you've traced, the pungent tang of stables, the mustiness of storage rooms, the faint sweetness of herbs in private chambers, and the layered, dynamic aromas of the cellars, all coalesce into a rich, living memory. You realize that the castle is less a static monument and more a breathing organism, each stone, timber, and corridor participating in a continuous, invisible dialogue of scent. It's easy to imagine that, in its heyday, every breath carried information about labor, hierarchy, comfort, and survival. You take a slow, deliberate inhale, letting the layers mingle in your mind. There's the earthy foundation of stone and mortar, the warmth of wood, the faint tang of iron and leather, and the subtle interventions of perfumed oils, incense, and herbs. Even decay, so often ignored, has its place. The faint musky notes of damp, the sharp tang of vinegar, and the mineral smell of water-saturated stone all form part of a larger narrative. Life, in its complexity, cannot be separated from its olfactory reality, and in a medieval castle, that reality was both unavoidable and intimate. As your mind drifts, you notice how each space in the castle contributes a unique note to this vast, unseen symphony. The kitchens and stables provide intensity and immediacy, reminding you of labor and necessity. The private chambers offer subtlety and intentionality, a quiet balance against the more aggressive odors elsewhere. The cellars and subterranean passages ground the experience, blending utility, preservation, and the ongoing presence of life's humblest elements. You can almost map the castle in your imagination, purely through scent, a sensory journey as detailed and coherent as any visual or auditory exploration. You feel a soft relaxation settling into your body as your mind wanders through these scentscapes. There is a rhythm here, a tempo to the odors themselves, the pulsing, heated smells of cooking, the steady, dry scent of grains in storage, the fleeting sweetness of herbs and perfumed linens. Even decay, so often ignored, has its place. The faint musky notes of damp, the sharp tang of vinegar, and the mineral smell of water-saturated stone all form part of a larger narrative. Life, in its complexity, cannot be separated from its olfactory reality, and in a medieval castle, that reality was both unavoidable and intimate. Your mind drifts further, reflecting on how these scents might have affected medieval social life. Conversation, negotiation, celebration, and ritual all took place within these olfactory contexts. You imagine courtiers moving through corridors, their perfumes mingling with the persistent, unavoidable odors of life. A subtle negotiation of identity and perception, comfort and hierarchy. Even the simplest acts, folding linens, stirring a pot, sweeping rushes, contributed to the invisible, ever-present story of smell. And now, as the castle grows quiet in your mind, the scents begin to fade slightly, leaving just their faintest echoes. The pungent tang of stables softens, the earthy damp of cellars recedes, the delicate fragrance of herbs and candles lingers like a gentle reminder. There is a comforting rhythm in this fading, a reminder that all things change, that even overwhelming realities, smells, sounds, sensations, can settle into memory and peace. You feel your own breath slow in time with the imagined cadence of the castle itself. Think of the castle not just as stone and wood, but as an ecosystem of life, labor, and presence. The smellscape connects every part of the structure, linking kitchens, chambers, battlements, and cellars into a continuous, living experience. You can sense that the olfactory journey you've taken tonight mirrors life itself. Layered, persistent, sometimes pungent, sometimes subtle, but always rich with meaning and connection. Even centuries later, the scent memory persists, a trace of humanity and inhabitation that transcends time. And now, as you prepare to leave this olfactory exploration behind, the images, sensations, and smells fade gently, replaced by a soft calm. Your mind is quieting, attuned to the textures, rhythms, and aromas that once defined life in a medieval fortress.
You feel a softness in your awareness, a gentle slowing of thought and perception. The castle's scents, now faded to whispers, leave a lasting impression of human ingenuity, care, and adaptability. Take one final slow breath, letting the imagination of stone, wood, herbs, and human life settle fully. You are carried forward by the memory of smells, earthy, pungent, sweet, sharp, and layered, into a restful, quiet space within yourself. The castle, with all its complexities, lives on in your mind, a sensory experience rich with history, humanity, and subtle wonder. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the lingering aromas of a medieval castle drift gently into your sleep, carrying you through layers of time, labor, and life, until all is calm, quiet, and sweet. End of script. Sweet dreams.